You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio. Welcome to the Bitter Medicine Podcast, where it's all about Black empowerment. Our show focuses on Black news and entertainment, arts, science, economics, history, people, and strategies that uplift, empower, and motivate Africans within the diaspora. And now, your host, whose favorite color is black, Goku.
Peace, family. Welcome back to the Bitter Medicine Podcast. I am your host, Goku, here today with you guys, bringing another live stream episode. This week, we're going to be talking about, it's an old paper that talks about the Monroe Doctrine and its application to Haiti, right? Let me just fix something right here real quick. All right. And so, for those of you, you probably noticed already, but there's some unrest going on in Haiti right now. There are calls for the Haitian president to step down. If you're on social media, you'll know that there's a hashtag Free Haiti that's been going on, that's been trending on social media for a few days now. Because of the unrest that's going on, and it's being considered a political crisis, right? There are armed gangs apparently that are carrying out for ransom kidnappings. Protesters are taken to the street. They ask the president to step down. From what I understand, with President Jovenel Moise, not Moise, but Moise, is that he is trying to extend his term. There's some dispute as to when his term began, and he's trying to extend it. So there's the idea of, some corruption going on from a political standpoint that's now pouring into the streets because of the frustration. And I hate to hear it, because apparently, with all this increase in crime, the people most affected, and it's typically the demographic most affected are women and girls, right? The claim is that women and girls are being kidnapped and gang raped at these alarming rates, right? One of the things that has come up in this turmoil in Haiti currently is the Monroe Monroe Doctrine. And so I wanted to read a paper that discusses the Monroe Doctrine as it relates to Haiti, right? Before I continue with the paper, I just want to remind everyone that this show is a part of a podcast network called KWAZ Radio. You can find KWAZ Radio in the chat room right now, so you should be able to click on them, or even just do a YouTube search and find KWAZ Radio. Make sure you guys follow that channel as well. There are other shows on KWAZ Radio besides the Bitter Medicine Podcast, shows that you should be checking out.
This is DAX. You tune into the Harsh Reality Podcast, providing you with social commentary on the news affecting our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-Black perspective, where Black problems are addressed with Black solutions.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Definitely check those shows out, as well as the Queen's Council Podcast. The Queen's Council Podcast, the Harsh Reality Podcast, and the Pro-Black Perspective all had shows that dropped at some time on Sunday. Pro-Black Perspective did a 4-hour show last night. I think it was last night. A 4-hour show. I was able to tune in for at least half of it last night, so I'll finish that off tomorrow. You guys should be checking those shows as well. Always informative, hip, and fun. All right. In the chat room, I see there's activities already. Let me shout out who's here. Black Excellence says greetings. NYC Beauty says black first and always. Kevin Care 42 says yes. NYC Beauty says looking forward to a great show. The pro-black perspective. But only to say jumps in, says peace, fam. Kevin Care 42 says this reminds me of what happened in the 90s with Cedrus and Aristide. NYC Beauty says these misleaders are just puppets for the West. Enough is enough. Kevin Care 42 says like, share, subscribe, and comment. Support black media, help this channel grow. And I agree with all of that was said. You guys need to like, share, and comment the content. If you have a Haitian brethren or sister right now, pull them into the live discussion. If you're listening to this on a playback, share it with them. Let them hear about the Monroe Doctrine and its application to Haiti. So let's get into it. So this paper was written by William A. MacCorkle, former governor of West Virginia. And for those who don't know, you know, the Monroe Doctrine essentially is this idea that the U.S. came up, I forget which president it was, President Monroe, came up with this idea that during a State of the Union address in 1823, that basically Europe wasn't supposed to get into matters of the West, that America was the dominant force, and any European nation getting involved in matters with countries in the West, the U.S. was going to take that as a sign of war, right? So it's basically a foreign policy doctrine, right? That's advocating for U.S. dominance in the Americas, and they're trying to prevent any influence of Europeans in this region. So that ties into like what happened in Grenada with Maurice Bishop and them in 1981, right? The U.S. will claim that, you know, they felt that some European power was meddling around in their area, in their jurisdiction. And so they take it upon themselves to become kind of the police of the neighborhood, right? And at one time, the U.S. government claimed national security interests in the northern part of Haiti, the part of Haiti closest to the U.S. So there's a history here with the U.S. and Haiti. Well, it even goes back further than that, but I might talk about that during the reading, depending on where the reading takes us. But during the Monroe Doctrine also is why Hawaii was pulled into the United States, right? And so you got to understand what these folks have set up. And you got to understand when you allow these folks to set up this kind of dominance, understand the problem that you're going to have going forward. And right now, with the turmoil going on in Haiti, some of the Haitian folks are saying it in the news and on camera and stuff. You know, look up the Monroe Doctrine. So let's read about the Monroe Doctrine. In the discussions to which this interest has given rise and in the arrangements by which they may terminate, the occasion has been judged proper for asserting, as a principle in which the rights and interests of the United States are involved, that the American continent, by the free and independent condition which they have assumed to maintain, are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by any European powers. So this is a strong declaration that says, that's backed by military might, by the way, right? That says, we are telling you, we're not on this colonization thing by any European power anymore, and by extension, we don't want you even involved in our hemisphere. As soon as you cross that line, remember when we were kids, you'll draw the line in the sand and say, well, if you're bad, cross the line. That's what America did in that statement. If you're bad, cross the line. And we'll take you on militarily. And that's when you're talking about nation building and power. That's the kind of stuff you need to be aiming for, right? The political system of the Allied powers is essentially different in this respect from that of America. The difference proceeds from that which exists in their respective governments and to the defense of our own, which has been achieved by the loss of so much blood and treasure, and matured by the wisdom of their most enlightened citizens, and under which we have enjoyed unexampled felicity. This whole nation is devoted. We owe it, therefore, to candor and to the amicable relations existing between the United States and those powers to declare that we should consider any attempt on their part to extend their system to any portion of this hemisphere as dangerous to our peace and safety. With the existing colonies or dependencies of any European power, we have not interfered and shall not interfere. But with the governments who have declared their independence and maintained it, and whose independence we have, on great consideration and on just principles, acknowledged, we could not view any interposition for the purpose of oppressing them or controlling in any other manner their destiny by any European power in any other light that as the manifestation of an unfriendly disposition towards the United States. Now understand that writing is propaganda. And the better you write something, the better the propaganda. Like when you read that, you kind of get the, this impression of how badass America at least thinks it is. Right? We'll be cool, we'll be friendly with y'all, but don't cross that line. Don't cross that line. Y'all do what you're doing already, etc. We ain't gonna really bother what you got going on, but don't cross that line. And that's the thing that happened to Haiti after 1804. After 1804, Haiti's government was not recognized. Its sovereignty was not recognized. Right? Its sovereignty was not recognized. Meanwhile, like the DR and stuff, its sovereignty was recognized. Because the Haitians fought off these three different powers, and so no one wanted to mess with them after that. And so they put Haiti in an economic underdevelopment at that point. They isolated them, right? And the U.S. didn't get involved at that time. Sometime later, the U.S. plays a heavy hand in Haiti, right? In the chat room, I see some activity. In the chat room, I see some activity. Kevin K42 says, this reminds me of what happened in the 90s with Cedrus and Aristida. Yeah, I read that before, sorry. Kevin K42 says, the Monroe Doctrine equals American colonialism. Yeah, same thing happened in Jamaica with Michael Manley of the JLP, Jamaican Labour Party. Manley wanted to join up with Castro, and the U.S. panicked. Don't forget that the U.S. put Trujillo in the DR. He had thousands of Haitians killed in the Parsley Massacre. Yeah, that's right. Black Excellence says the Western Hemisphere is the web and the United States is the predatory spider. The pro-black perspective says draw the line in the sand, echoing the words I uttered a few minutes ago. Black Excellence also says look what happened with Allende in Chile. The United States had him killed September 11, 1973 by Pinochet's troops bombing La Moneda. Draw the line in the sand. That's when you got power, you don't have no kind of like sissified testimony to your power. You draw that line and you tell motherfuckers, cross the line if you're bad, right? Our policy in regard to Europe, which was adopted at an early stage of the wars which had so long agitated that quarter of the globe, nevertheless remains the same, which is not to interfere in the internal concerns of any of its powers, to consider the governments de facto as a legitimate government for us, to cultivate friendly relations with it, and to preserve those relations by a frank, firm, and manly policy, meeting in all instances the just claims of every power, submitting to injuries from none. But in regard to those continent's circumstances are eminently and conspicuously different. It is impossible that the Allied power should extend their political system to any portion of either continent without endangering our peace and happiness. Nor can anyone believe that our southern brethren, if left to themselves, will adopt it on their own accord. President Roosevelt's interpretation of the later doctrine. We must recognize the fact that in South American countries, there has been much suspicion lest we should interpret the Monroe Doctrine as in some way inimical to their interests. And we must try to convince all the other nations of the continent once and for all that no just and orderly government has anything to fear from us. Bullshit. There are certain republics to the south of us which have already reached such a point of stability, order, and prosperity, that they themselves, though as yet hardly consciously, are among the guarantors of this doctrine. These republics we now meet not only on a basis of entire equality, but in a spirit of frank and respectful friendship, which we hope is mutual. If all the republics to the south of us will only grow as those to which I allude have already grown, all need for us to be the especial champions of the doctrine will disappear. For no stable and growing American republic wishes to see some great non-American military power acquire territory in its neighborhood. And that's why the idea of doing something heavy in the Caribbean is problematic. Because even if you start to build some kind of power, especially military power, these guys I've told you, cross the line, see what happens. Right? I remember when Bishop, I remember reading about, well, first of all, I remember when it happened in Grenada. I remember the news, I remember seeing Reagan on TV talking about it. And I remember one of the things that came out of what happened in Grenada, and some friends of mine who are older than me who really went through it and really experienced it, who are from Grenada, telling me about how you would have white folks moving into Grenada as like expats or seemingly like tourists or whatever, right? Living in homes, right? But quietly they had these telescopic cameras and telescopes and whatnot, surveying the land and taking pictures of the people, right? This is what you do when you have these different folks other than your nation in your neighborhood. You surveil them, you keep an eye on them, right? You got to know what they're doing. All that this country desires is that the other republics on the continent shall be happy and prosperous, and they cannot be happy and prosperous unless they maintain order within their boundaries and behave with a just regard for their obligations towards outsiders. It must be understood that under no circumstances will the United States use the Monroe Doctrine as a cloak for territorial aggression. How many of you think that's true? We desire peace with all the world, but perhaps most of all with the other peoples of the American continent. There are, of course, limits to the wrongs in which any self-respecting nation can endure. It is always possible that wrong actions toward this nation or towards citizens of this nation in some state unable to keep order amongst its own people, unable to secure justice from outsiders, and unwilling to do justice to those outsiders who treated well, may result in our having to take action to protect our rights. But such action will not be taken with a view to territorial aggression, and it will be taken at all only with extreme reluctance, and when it has become evident that every other resource has been exhausted. Again, when I talk about when something is well written, it's good propaganda, right? Now we know for a fact that the U.S. installs puppet regimes. We know for a fact that they cause unrest, civil unrest in countries to destabilize them and to get the political parties in charge, so to speak, out of there. So what this doctrine doesn't talk about is their underhandedness in certain countries that then leads them to feel it's okay for them, right, to go into a person's country and basically police it, right? This brings us to a portion of the paper called the Lodge Resolution. Resolved that when our harbor and other place in the American continent is so situated that the occupation thereof for naval or military purposes might threaten the communications or the safety of the United States, the government of the United States could not see without craven concern the possession of such harbor or other place by any corporation or association which has such a relation to another government, not American, as to give that government practical power of control for national purposes, ... That the Monroe Doctrine made its apparent advent in the history of nations so late as the time of the president of that name has to a certain extent diminished its importance as part of the fundamental and international life in the thought of the nations of the world. Whilst this doctrine did not form part of the written law of this country, still it originated in the very life of the American Republic and is not as a matter of truth the doctrine of President Monroe, but rather the doctrine which was part of the actual life of this republic in its inception. It was enunciated as a foundation proposition of our government by Washington, was interpreted and insisted upon as part of our fundamental life by Jefferson, and finally upon the historic occasion established as the Monroe Doctrine. Writers are fond of frequently repeating the statement that the Monroe Doctrine is not part of the international code, but that is merely a policy of this government and only so understood in the law of nations. While this may be the thought among other nations, the Monroe Doctrine is as absolutely part of the life of this republic in its dealings with the nations of the world as any doctrine of international law expressed and published as such by the nations of the world. It is fundamentally the doctrine of the greatest and most powerful nation on earth. One would question that, and so understood to be a primary doctrine by the 100 millions of people forming the great Western Republic. It is not technically part of the code of international law. It is the belief of our people that it forms an essential part of the structure of our national life. Secretary Foster stated, "It has been said that the Monroe Doctrine has no binding authority. First, because it has not been admitted into the Code of International Law, and second, because it has never been adopted or declared by Congress. In reply, it may be said that the principle which underlies the Monroe Doctrine, the right of self-defense, the preservation of the peace and safety of the nation, is recognized as an elementary part of international law. It stands today as a cardinal policy of our government." Now, when you really read this and you understand what's been going on since the time of this doctrine being declared to now, the thing that really prevents another country, quote unquote, prevents another country from doing this is the ability to enforce it. The problem is, you can say this for your nation. You can say exactly this for your nation. The problem is, can you enforce it? And that's the problem that we see where there's African people, there's this African problem. The inability to enforce the rules of your nation. In the chat room, Kevin K42 says, edit, Michael Manley was with the PNP, the People National Party. Edward Siega, who was the puppet, was with the JLP, Jamaican Labour Party. Kevin K goes on to say they are trying to bully China in the South China Seas, but China is practically telling the United States to cross that line. The United States speaks with a forked tongue. The great book is Confessions of an Economic Hitman. A great podcast episode is the Pro-Black Perspectives. Forget the title of that episode, but go back about, let's say, a month ago, month and a half. Pro-Black Perspective does a great episode where he discusses parts of the Confessions of an Economic Hitman. Chemical 42 goes on to say, remember when the United States Navy was using the Puerto Rican island of Vieques as a bombing range during the late 90s to 2000s? Yes. And the thing is, with a lot of this stuff where the U.S. does, this puffing up of the chest, you still have to stand on something as a smaller nation. I don't care what they say. I told a story on the podcast before, but there was an instance in the Bahamas where just before independence, I think it was. Oh no, maybe just at independence. The U.S. had some canisters of nerve gas. And nerve gas had been outlawed for use. And the U.S. needed to dump or get rid of this canisters of nerve gas, and they wanted to dump it in our waters. And the leaders of the country, opposition, and the former leaders of the country told them, hell no. The United States said, well, it's safe. It's not a problem. Our leaders said, well, if it's so safe, put it in your waters. Right? Now, can the Bahamas stand up to American military might? Absolutely not. Right? But a part of the fear would have been, I suspect, if you wanted to get aggressive with that country over that, right, some other folks would have gotten involved to help protect the country, right? But you have to have balls to stand up to people who are making rules for them and for you. And that's something that African nations got to start doing. You got to start having some balls to speak up against rules that someone is making to benefit themselves and to police you, right? While this doctrine may be a policy and not a part of the technical code of international law, it has for 100 years held the hands of the mightiest nations on earth who have recognized its potency equally with the recognition which they have extended to any principle of international law. The law of self-preservation is the most fundamental and absolute of all laws of nations. It's actually the most fundamental law of individuals, and individuals make up nations, so by extension nations find it as a fundamental and absolute of all the laws. The Monroe Doctrine is the one vital doctrine which in our intercourse with other nations most vitally controls, quote unquote, our peace and happiness, and quote unquote peace and safety. It is idle for any authority to contend that a principle so vital as this does not have the real potency and effect of international law. Throughout the discussions by the fathers and by those who latterly placed the doctrine in active effect, the one continuing thread runs that underlying this doctrine are, quote unquote, the peace and safety and the quote unquote, the peace and happiness of the American nation. This doctrine was, in one sense of the word, a negative proposition. With the life of the world, it has changed, not in its fundamental idea, for it is founded upon the preservation of the safety and peace of this republic, but the change has come to a certain extent with the altered condition of the times and surroundings of our life, in the mode of our application of its principles. In this discussion, we found our argument upon the Monroe Doctrine both in its original and its latter construction. We believe as a cardinal principle of its application that independence is fundamental. To differ with another country in its ideas, to differ with another country in its ideas of government will form no reason why we should deprive any country of its governmental life and existence. We concede that because of the difference in thought as to governmental policy, we should not interfere with or establish over any government a suzerainty or control. We do not contend that Monroe Doctrine applies to a country unless the acts of the country interfere with the doctrine in our interpretation of its principles as to control by European nations, or unless it interferes with the preservation of our peace and safety, or unless it commits a breach of international law. The distinguished president of the Academy has assigned to me the subject of, quote unquote, the Monroe Doctrine especially considered as its application to the Republic of Haiti. Let us see if the conditions arising in this island interfere with any of the canons of this doctrine. So it looks like they're going to talk about some of the history that I mentioned earlier that I would talk about if the paper does it, right? The island of Hispaniola, containing Haiti and San Domingo, contains about 28,250 square miles, and the Republic of Haiti about 10,200 square miles. The island is about the size of the combined states of Delaware, Massachusetts, Jersey, New Hampshire, and Rhode Island. Let me read that again. The island is about the size of the combined states of Delaware, Massachusetts, New Jersey, New Hampshire, and Rhode Island. Now, I'll tell you this, I didn't know that. And I know some of those states are small, but still they're states, right? I'm a little surprised by that. Next to Cuba, it is the most important strategical point in the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean Sea. It is directly on the commands, the two great passages of the Atlantic Ocean into the Caribbean Sea from the eastern coast of the United States to and from the canal. It thus practically controls the great bulk of the commerce of the United States to the east Pacific Ocean. I want y'all to pay attention to what this fellow is telling you here. All right? Pay attention to that. This island has within its shores more natural wealth than has any other territory of similar size in the world. By reason of its rich valleys and splendid mountains, it has every temperature known to man. All tropical plants and trees, as well as the vegetables and fruits of the temperate climates, grow in perfection. The best coffee known to commerce grows wild without planting or cultivation. Sugarcane, indigo, breadfruit, melons, mangoes, oranges, apples, grapes, mulberries, and figs all grow with little labor or care. The mahogany, manchineel satin wood, rosewood, cinnamon wood, logwood, the pine, the oak, cypress, and palmetto grow in rich profusions in its splendid soil. Here are the best dyestuffs known to commerce, and in the earth are silver, gold, copper, lead, iron, gypsum, and sulfur. Also in that soil is Clinton's family, right? We hazard that the statement that this island is more capable of supporting life in all of its phases, more able to create wealth and diffuse happiness to its people than any other land on the face of the earth. Its harbors are incomparable and will float the navies of the world. Its atmosphere is salubrious and its climate healthy. It is a natural paradise, and the description of its beauty and resources by Columbus is absolutely true as of today. I guess we get a Columbus quote here. In it, there are many havens on the seacoast, incomparable with any others I know in Christendom, and plenty of rivers, so good and great that it is a marvel. The lands there are high, and in it are very many ranges of hills and most lofty mountains, incomparably beyond the island of Santa Fe. All most beautiful in 1,000 shapes, and all accessible, and full of trees of 1,000 kinds, so lofty that they seem to reach the sky. And I am assured that they never lose their foliage, as may be imagined, since I saw them as green and as beautiful as they are in Spain in May. And some of them were in flower, some in fruit, some in other stage according to their kind. And the nightingale was singing, and other birds of 1,000 sorts in the month of November, round about the way I was going. There are palm trees of 6 or 8 species, wondrous to see for their beautiful variety. But so are the other trees and fruits and plants therein. There are wonderful pine groves and very large plants of verdure, and there are honey and many kinds of birds and many mines in the earth, and there is a population of incalculable number. Hispaniola is a marvel, the mountains of hills and plains and fields, and the soil so beautiful and rich for planting and sowing, for breeding cattle, for all sorts, for building of towns and villages. There could be no believing without seeing such harbors as I hear, as well as the many and great rivers and excellent waters, most of which contain gold. The trees and fruits and plants, they're greater diversities from those of Cuba. In this, there are many spiceries and great mines of gold and other metals. The people of this island and all others that I have seen or not seen, all go naked, men and women, just as their mothers bring them forth. You know, when I was reading that, you know what that made me think about, man? And I know this is gonna sound crazy, but it almost sounds like what someone will describe as heaven. And the idea that they have you waiting for heaven upon death, when clearly we could have heaven on earth. It's just crazy. I mean, these guys recognize it, right? Or I should say, those guys recognize it, right? In the chat room. In the chat room, NYC Beauty says another great book is Dark Alliance by Gary Webb, R.I.P. To show how the CIA was smuggling drugs into the country. Gary Webb, by the way, was found with 2 bullets in the back of his head. They ruled this a suicide. NYC Beauties goes on to say one last book is called Behold a Pale Horse by William Cooper, a former naval intelligence officer, R.I.P. All right, so those are some books you could check out, courtesy of NYC Beauties. All right, the seas which are today actually and prospectively most important to mankind are the Mediterranean Sea, the Gulf of Mexico, and the Caribbean Sea. Let me read that again. The seas which are today actually and prospectively most important to mankind are the Mediterranean Sea, the Gulf of Mexico, and the Caribbean Sea. I want to ask you guys who listen to me live right now, even if you're listening to playback, do you think these words from MacCorkle is still true today? These seas and their importance have waxed and waned as have all other lands and seas of the globe. Whilst the Mediterranean has been important throughout history, today as a part of the chain of communication to the east, it is probably more vital than ever in its history, for it commands the Suez Canal and is virtually part of the Suez Route. The 2 great twin seas, the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean Sea, are, if possible, more vital than the Mediterranean in their effect upon the commerce of the world. From their position, they will be more worldwide in their direct influence upon commerce than the Mediterranean, because these 2 seas will embrace a greater part of the world. It is necessary to our subject briefly to discuss the location of Haiti, both in its strategical and trade positions. We would say that in the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean Sea, there are 5 great strategical positions: the mouth of the canal, the mouth of the Mississippi, Cuba, Haiti, and Jamaica. The mouth of the Mississippi necessarily will command the great central valley of the United States, and here will be one of the great positions in the trade of the world. From the mouth of the Mississippi to Cologne, our commerce will have a straight course, passing Cape Cotuche, the outermost point of Yucatan, and Cape Gracias a Dios on the Mosquito Coast. This route will pass the island of Mujeres, which is not important, but will be within easy striking distance of the great island of Jamaica, owned by Great Britain. So you could tell this paper is pretty old, because Jamaica got its independence back in like 52, I think it was. 50 or 52. The island of Cuba is the great controlling strategical influence in the Caribbean Sea and the Gulf of Mexico. It lies across the route from North America and largely commands the route from the mouth of the Mississippi to the eastern opening of the canal. It controls the passage from the Gulf of Mexico into the Caribbean Sea through the Yucatan Channel and into the Gulf of Mexico from the Atlantic by the Florida Straits. It is the great controlling strategical influence in the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean Sea. They have an image here, but it's sideways, and I hate to mess with the view, Okay, let's see. Right, but you can see the Caribbean Sea, the Gulf of Mexico, right? You can see the Bahamas, Haiti, Cuba, Puerto Rico and Jamaica. And I dare say these North Caribbean islands here, the U.S. has a constant eye on these islands right here because of their proximity, but as this paper just suggested, because of the sea routes, right? Look at where Cuba is, and look at where the Yucatan is, right? This passes right through here, takes you to Mississippi, right? The mouth of the Mississippi River, right? And believe it or not, those areas are still super important today. Was Jamaican independence 62? My bad. 62. I said 52 originally. My bad. 62. So in any event, this tells you that the paper is pretty old. But I want y'all to pay attention to this map. And again, if you guys ever want these papers, by all means, reach out to me and I'll give it to you. In fact, you could join the Discord. Let me post the link. You could join the Discord at any time, and you could find these links in the Discord. Yeah, I see KW Don 7 is here. Peace to KW Don 7, KW Don, and NYC Beauties corrected me. Jamaica got its independence in 62. I should have known better than 52. And Trinidad was 63, I believe. 63 or 64. The Bahamas was 73. Right? Okay. But and look at the movements of ships to Europe, to Great Britain, around the Haitis, between the Puerto Ricos, right? Around Cuba. It's very interesting, and people don't understand. A man will kill you if you block his routes, right? For him to be able to import, to get what he wants, and to sell what he wants. A man will kill you for that. And so you have to brace up, so to speak, when you're dealing with a man like that. The second great strategical point is the island of Haiti. The two great routes to the mouth of the canal from North America are first the route by the Windward Passage between the island of Cuba and the island of Haiti. Second, the route by the Mona Passage between the island of Haiti and the island of Puerto Rico. This latter passage will be that chiefly used by the sailing vessels to and from the canal to the eastern point of North America. The other important passage to the mouth of the canal is the Anageta Passage by the island of St. Thomas and Puerto Rico, and will be the route used from the Isthmus to the Mediterranean and Central Europe. To travel to the British Islands and Northern Europe will also use the Mona Passage between Haiti and Puerto Rico. In other words, every ship sailing from New York, Philadelphia, Charleston, Canada, Baltimore, Newport News, or the east coast of North America on its journeys to the infinite world of commerce will be compelled to pass by the island of Haiti, either through the Windward or the Mona Passage, and to travel to the greater part of Europe will use the Mona Passage by the east coast of Haiti. Now do you understand? Now do you get, it's not just, everyone talks about what's in the soil in Haiti, right? No one talks about what's around Haiti, right? No one talks about these passages around Haiti. Kevin Kerr mentions the region is also major drug smuggling routes. Yeah, absolutely. Trust me, I know. I come up through a country that's at one time was renowned for its drug. In fact, if you listen to Joe Biden tell it, Joe Biden says that the crack epidemic comes from the Bahamas, which I find wild to say. But, you know, he's kind of doting these days. So I guess what he meant was that a lot of those drugs did pass through the Bahamas. This worldwide commerce, in case of stress and storm on its voyage to the commercial world, must utilize this great island and the necessities of sea life. It is the first great harboring place on its way to the canal, and on its return it is the last stopping place. It will be as necessary to the commerce of this country as Malta, or Aden, or Gibraltar are to the Suez route. It lies athwart, the greatest commerce that will cleave the seas. In the present governmental condition of Haiti and with its relation to this country, the island of Jamaica will be supremely important from a strategical standpoint if controlled or held by an unfriendly power, and it could cripple our commerce passing through the Windward or the Monroe Passage. With the friendly influence of Cuba and Haiti, the commerce of the United States would have a tremendous advantage in case of war or unfriendliness on the part of any nation, even if Jamaica was held by an unfriendly power. It is usual to speak of the Caribbean Sea and the Gulf of Mexico as the American seas. I've never heard that before. And to consider them as part of our life and practically within the control of this great nation. It is important to glance at these great seas and appreciate how they and the canal are environed about and controlled by islands which would become vital to our commerce in case of war or unfriendliness of the nations of Europe. First is the island of Jamaica, owned by Great Britain, which is practically at the mouth of the canal. Of almost equal importance is the island of Curacao, which in the hands of an unfriendly power would be disastrous in its effect upon the commerce of the canal. To the east and within striking distance are Martinique in the hands of France, Santa Lucia or St. Lucia, owned by England, St. Thomas, owned by Denmark, the Bahamas and the Bermudas in the hands of England, with Cuba and Haiti in independent control. With Cuba and Haiti in independent control, neither which last two could be utilized by the United States in case of conflict or with the other nations of the world. In other words, the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean Sea are environed by islands in the control of the two great nations of the world, France and England, and by two great islands, Haiti and Cuba, the latter of which are strategically so situated that they could largely control the commerce of practically half of the world. Nothing is by chance, folks. Nothing is by chance. In this sea, the United States, to which this commerce is supremely vital, with the exception of the harbor of Guantanamo in Cuba, controls only the relatively insignificant island of Puerto Rico. Ouch, Puerto Ricans. Anytime a Puerto Rican try to break bad with you, just cite that right there. Right. You're relatively insignificant. Outside of these unimportant exceptions, the United States has no right to fortify any of the islands or to use them as bases from which we can protect our commerce and our rights in the canal. Let us consider as briefly as possible the governmental and social conditions in the Republic of Haiti, so importantly located as it is, and the probability of its becoming a menace to the fundamental principles of the Monroe Doctrine. It is important for us to see if it offends against the peace and safety of our country. This is not a pleasant subject of discussion. No one cares to indict a whole people, but the question of the future of this island in its relations to this republic is one of deep and abiding importance to the American people, and surely in the conditions of today, worthy of discussion in the publications of this society. It is practically part of the shoreline of our republic, and is in control of the avenues of our greatest routes of commerce to the world, and lies at the mouth of the canal, which has cost us untold sums of money. Through its great passages will flow the bulk of our commerce to the east, And the question for consideration with the American people is whether this commerce should oftentimes be placed in the control of a government continuously engaged in internecine war, revolution and insurrection, and sunk in religious and governmental degeneracy. I want y'all to pick up what they just said this now. Right? Pick up what they just said right now. Through its great passages will flow the bulk of commerce for the East, and the question for consideration with the American people is whether this commerce should oftentimes be placed in the control of a government continuously engaged in internecine war, revolution, and insurrection, and sunk in religious and government degeneracy. The question is vital to us as to whether the condition of this island, so important to us, will ultimately lead to interference on the part of European nations or compel us, in order to preserve the peace and safety of our country, to provide by some means that its present condition be changed, and instead of being a menace to the peace and safety of our republic, it may become a blessing to the world and a protection to the commerce which will be the greatest ever witnessed since the keels of mankind's ships began to cleave the water in their quest for knowledge and riches throughout the world. So this tells you what the European mindset is, right? They're trying to understand what's going on in the world and for riches. But a rational thinking person would question, well, would have the question, well, then why don't you work with these important countries instead of constantly trying to keep them destabilized, right? Instead of sinking them in this IMF debt, like in the case of Jamaica, where what is the money in Jamaica now? When I was a kid, it was like 1 to 40. At one point, since I've been up here, it's been 1 to 120 or something like that. What's the exchange now for Jamaican money to US dollars, right? You would think a rational, non-savage person would say, hey, let's work together. We can all break bread. These folks still look at our folks as slaves. And they look at our satellite nations, right? These African satellites, known as the Caribbean. They look at it as slave plantations. And how can you keep them destabilized, right, while we still get the bulk of the riches, right? In the chat room, Kevin Care 42 said this is why China wants to make this part of their Belt and Road Initiative. When maritime commerce is embargoed, the warships come out. Absolutely, right? Kevin Care 42 also says 1 Jamaican dollar equals, I want y'all to follow this now, 1 Jamaican dollar equals 0.0068 of a US dollar. Understand why. Let us briefly, as may be, answer this question by giving the condition of this island as set out by those who have visited its shores and who are conversant with its conditions. That which shows the real life of a nation in its governmental policy and its religious ideas. To these two propositions, I invite your attention. That's why I knew that based on what was read earlier, just a few sentences ago, is to pay attention to what this guy is saying, right? Since the evacuation by the French, Haiti has been a land of seething revolution, despotism, and crime against religious and governmental law. With the forms of a free government, yet it has been a despotism unrivaled in its disregard for human rights. A general of a department with a ragged army of banditti behind him, who by blood and rape seizes control of the government, sometimes without the pretense of the forms of an election, has generally furnished the horrid phantasmagoria which since the French Revolution has posed in the Haitian Republic under the guise of free government. Says Aubert, founded as it is upon force with the strongest man at the head, nominally as president, but in reality a dictator, the Black Republic cannot endure another century as it is going now, without calling to it the attention of the world and exciting its strongest reprobation. It is the desire of more than one government that the United States should take this irresponsible island republic in hand and administer to it a salutary lesson. Now, why would more than one nation want the U.S. to do that? Remember what we talked about with those trade routes, right? Nothing short of extermination, some aver, could affect a reform in the Haitian body politic. But as this age does not tolerate the radical measures of the olden time, it is not possible that the present generation will experience a reformation. So if you read into that sentence really wants to say, let's go and destroy this nation. But because you know, quote unquote, times have changed, right? You might not get the fervor behind it, right? They won't do it. Sir Spencer St. John, who was formerly the English minister resident in Haiti, I guess that's like an ambassador, and who wrote an exhaustive account of the doings in the Black Republic, says of it, amongst other things not complimentary, quote, no country possesses greater capabilities or a better geographical position, or more varied soil, climate, or production, with magnificent scenery of every description. And yet it is now the country to be avoided, ruined as it has been by a succession of self-seeking politicians without honesty or patriotism. You know, it blows my mind every time I see these folks talk about a place like Haiti, right? It just blows my mind that, you know, these folks don't talk about the 300 years before 1804 with the savage, brutal slavery that occurred on that island, much less its half of Haiti or Haiti, right? Or, you know, 300 years, the 300 years leading up to the Haitian Revolution, they don't talk about, especially over on the Spanish side, they don't talk about how the men were killed off. I mean, continuously, and the women were raped, and they bred in this kind of Spanish class, and the Spaniards always held rule because, of course, they were under Spain, right? They don't talk about that kind of stuff, right? They don't talk about how after 1804, Haiti was commercially and politically isolated, right? They don't talk about the fact that the American economy was fueled by slavery, and because of the Haitian Revolution, that started to mess with the slavery that they had in America. Remember, Haiti took up the cause of freeing other countries. Enslaved Africans in America heard about what was going on in Haiti and started to rebel more. It started making slavery detrimental to the United States, right? If you remember, Frederick Douglass talked about how Haitians at one time were held highly, right? That Haitians could go anywhere and not be looked upon poorly, not abused, right? He talks about how Haiti taught the world the danger of slavery and the value of liberty, right? So because of all these things, a country like the U.S. really decided to isolate Haiti. And all the powers decided to isolate Haiti, right? That led to a drop in commerce, right? A drop in agricultural production. And so then you had these clowns, now a succession of clowns, who came into leadership in Haiti, who was quote unquote all for me baby, right? But this paper is not going to talk about that, right? This paper is not going to talk about that. As Black Excellence in the chat room says, these guys aren't going to talk about while you isolated Haiti and there was a decline in its ability to carry out commerce and agriculture and all that stuff, you also imposed a heavy payment on Haiti. Could someone in the chat room let me know what in today's money is the amount Haiti paid? It's a crazy amount today. I've forgotten now. Black Excellence also says, sorry, can you imagine we have a united countries of the Caribbean, how powerful we will be? FBA and ADANS, what to be on this tribal bullcrap? Yeah, they want to be on this tribal bullcrap. Black Excellence says, read the Black Jacobins. Talks about what led up to the Haitian Revolution. I believe did I do a book review on that? I believe I did. So you guys could look that up. France had Haiti pay reparations to them, thus bankrupting Haiti to this day. We owe Haiti a debt of gratitude. KW7 says there are black people who still believe Haiti is cursed by God. That can only be true if you believe God is white, shaking my damn head. Black Excellence goes on to say Simon Bolivar, so-called George Washington of Latin America, had Haiti's help, but went back on his promises to Haiti to free the slaves in Latin America. That's true. Right? But KW Don hit on something very interesting there. When atrocities occur in Haiti, a lot of folks tend to think, man, it has to be that OBA y'all working in Haiti. That voodoo, that witch, as some people call it. But people don't understand what has happened to Haiti has been systematically done to Haiti. Right? And natural disasters do happen. Depending on where you're located, natural disasters happen. When a earthquake hits California, the people say it's because people work in witch and obeah and voodoo and all types of stuff. That's the reason why that happened? Nah. But because of the what's the word? Religiosity of black folks, right? And of many poor whites too, you can push that narrative and people will cling on to it, right? The island being thus derelict, Spain and England both tried their hand to recover it, but failed from the same cause, and a black nation with a republican constitution and a population perhaps of about 1.5 million of pure-blooded Negroes has since been in unchallenged possession and has arrived at a condition which has been described to us by Sir Spencer St. John. Republics which begin with murder and plunder do not come to much good in this world. Well, what does that say about the U.S.? Haiti has passed through many revolutions and is no nearer than at first to stability. The present president, M. Salomon, who was long a refugee in Jamaica, came into power a few days back by a turn of the wheel. He was described to me as a peremptory gentleman who made quick work with his political opponents. His term of office having nearly expired, he had re-elected himself shortly before another 7 years and was prepared to maintain his right by any measures which he might think expedient. What did I say about Juvenal? I think that's the president's name in Haiti today. He had a few regiments of soldiers who I was told were devoted to him, and a fleet consisting of 2 gunboats commanded by an American officer to whom he chiefly owed his security. An American officer to whom he chiefly owed his security. Think about it. Says Rear Admiral Colby M. Chester, U.S. Navy, a most careful and distinguished observer, in his article in the Geographical magazine on Haiti, a degenerating island. It is not possible within the limits of this paper to go into details regarding the turbulent history of Haiti. The fact that of its 21 rulers, from Dessalines to the one now holding power, 4 only have completed their terms of office, most of them being driven out of the country, will show the general tendency of the people to revolution. History is here constantly repeating itself, summed up in general statement that the outs are always struggling to get into power, while the ins are striving to retain possession of the spoils of office. It is said that Haiti is getting blacker and blacker, the white element having been practically exterminated or removed from the island. In all its political history, Haiti, the beautiful, has been torn almost to shreds by its turbulent inhabitants, led on by a few aspiring chiefs who rarely have had any other object in view than personal gain, says Stephen Bonsall in the American Mediterranean. So while I continue reading this paper, I want you guys to talk about, or at least think about, what do you do with Haiti? What I mean is, Haiti created its nation in 1804. Are Haitians to abandon that nation, quote unquote, abandon that nation? You read the description of Columbus in there, of the land. We know over the years what the Clintons and the Rodham family has been doing in Haiti, right? Taking its resources, stealing it, etc. Are the people of that nation supposed to give it up? That's the question. I'm gonna tell you right now, the folks ain't gonna ever give that up. So what are we to do? The other problem we have is we have the problem of this Monroe Doctrine, right? That this juggernaut, this military juggernaut, is going to come and get and mix itself up in your affairs. This is why every time you hear me lament the kind of ground we as black people, as African people, have given up. How are you going to deal with that juggernaut that's so close by? I mean, these guys could sit in Washington and launch missiles on Haiti, Jamaica, the Bahamas, Cuba. So what do you do? A, do you abandon these places and consolidate power in Africa? Or do you fight for these places? In the chat room, I see Erzuliism is in the room. Okay, let me get to you in a second. Erzuliism, Black Excellence says, look at all the evil that comes out of these Muzungu churches. Absolutely. Erzuliism, if you guys don't know, that's I had him on the show. That's Gunner. He did the he had his directorial debut. We talked about it on my show. Gunner, if that link is still active, if it's possible, post it in the chat room so folks could check out your film. Erzuliism says, for the crime, quote unquote, crime of shaking off the yoke of involuntary servitude, Haiti dutifully paid France reparations over the course of nearly 6 generations. Whew, with interest. France should now do the right thing and return those payments, estimated to total $21 billion in today's dollars. Now, we talked about this recently. France ain't really popping like that. France is making its money off the backs of African countries that it once held. right? What do we do about it? 21 billion, man. Black Excellence says that is bullcrap. That is a bullcrap term that Haiti is shredded by its people. It is Muzungu's interference that is the problem. Extreme capitalism from the Muzungus. They are blaming Haitians for what the Muzungus are doing. But here's the thing about it. Again, when you write, writing is propaganda, right? These guys aren't going to write about the little dealings that they have done in Haiti and how they've handicapped Haiti, right? So don't expect that from them. Expect them to speak in a way that makes them look good. KW Don 7 says Haiti has the same predicament as the continent. Absolutely. Azulism says, and all the gold that America stole when they invaded from 1914 to 1939. Azulism says, we are done. Goes on to say, fight with what? Now, I know Azulism personally. Just like I know Kevin Care 42, we all know each other. We're college friends. And whenever I talk to Azulism in person, one of his catchphrases is like, yo, we're done. Talking about black folks, talking about African folks, we're done. And I get where that sentiment comes from. I get where the idea of fight with what comes from. We've given up so much ground, but we can't give up. We can't give up. We got to figure out, and by now we really should have figured. I mean, and to be honest, we know what the problem is. I talked about it in the show several times. I repeat it all the time. Me and the pro-black perspective went back and forth about it in the chat room here on the show. Like, we gotta show the people the benefits of getting together, and only time I say would say, we gotta prove to them that we punish you worse than, the Muzungu would. Kevin Care 42 says, from a macro focus, they fear the rise of a black planet. Zuliism says, it's sad. They have all the weapons, the technology, the propaganda. Kevin Care 42 says, another thing is too much apathy in our community. Yes, we have to work on that too. Of course, Haiti were a true republic. The people would have an opportunity to correct the abuses from which they suffer by exercising the manhood franchise to which, under the Constitution, they are entitled. But of all farces and travesties of popular institutions which are so prevalent in the Black Republic, that of the so-called popular elections is the most flagrant. Elections to the chamber are held or not held, not as prescribed by law and at the proper intervals, but simply when and how it may suit the personal convenience and private profit of the supreme military chief of today. Now, if you're a white kid coming up and you read this paper, you would be indoctrinated in the idea like black folks can't control their own shit. But you and I know, you guys are black folks like me, we're intelligent people, we've studied the history. We know that it's these same white folks from this same country, in particular America, that's destabilizing countries like Haiti. And now we have even a better idea that some of us may not have had before. It's not just because of gold and silver in the rivers and stuff like what Columbus described, but it's these roots. You solidify Haiti and they have a military and they could block off those routes, and now these different nations got to come to you and talk about breaking bread with you. But instead, these countries want to still carry on that slavery mentality where they get the spoils of free labor. What can we do in Haiti? As KW Dawn 7 said, it's the same or similar predicament in the continent. Close your eyes and point at a spot in sub-Saharan Africa in particular, right? And you'll find the same or similar problems with Haiti. What do we do? Rolling over and dying is just not an option. At least I don't think so. Do you think so? Resistance has to be the option. It has to be smart. We got to get together. We got to get intelligent people working on the problem. Not just working on the problem, but actually getting people to work on all of the problems, right? Under the one umbrella problem that we have. Right? More money and bribes from the deputies already assembled and in session and is offered by those desirous of legislative honors and opportunities for corruption than the old chamber remains on indefinitely. If the new men offer to the military chief a sufficiently substantial inducement, the legislator in being is dismissed, although it may have enjoyed only a month of life, and new elections offered. Again, says Bonsal, in the winter of 1907 to 08, when 22 of the adherents of Dr. Furman fell into the hands of the administration general at St. Mark, that officer walked them out to the nearest cemetery, and after they had dug a trench deep enough to hold their bodies, had them shot and buried. He then reported to his commander-in-chief, President Nord Alexis, the occurrence textually as follows, quote, feeling confident that my process verbal of the affair, which I shall have drawn up at the earliest possible moment, would meet with your excellency's approval to save time. I have executed the 22 prisoners provisionally. End of quote. This butcher never received a word of censure, but on the contrary was promoted to his chief. The first effort is to obtain possession of the custom house so as to provide the sinews of war and to obtain prerequisites for those in charge of the revolution. Then ensues a massacre of those who followed the unsuccessful aspirant for the presidency. At its head is a president assisted by two chambers, the members of which are elected and hold office under a constitution of 1889. This constitution, thoroughly Republican in form, is French in origin, as are also the laws, language, traditions, and customs in Haiti. In practice, however, the government revolves itself into a military despotism, the power being concentrated in the hands of a president. The Haitians seem to possess everything that a progressive and civilized nation can desire, but corruption is spread through every portion and branch of government. Justice is venal, and the police are brutal and inefficient. Right? Now, it sounds like this guy is writing about stuff going on today, right? But again, this guy is not going to talk about what's the underlying cause. It says hazard in San Domingo in Haiti. But the same causes which tended then to demoralize the country and unsettle its people are those that render it a hotbed of revolution today. The bankruptcy of its treasury, the ambition of aspiring chiefs, the hatred of disappointed ones, and the want of any regular system of commerce and agriculture, with the incubus of an army living in idleness and eating up the substance of the land, must have their effect. Official peculation, judicial murder, and other corruption of every kind underlie the forms and titles of civilized government. The religion, nominally Christian, is largely voodoo, or serpent worship. Serpent worship. That's news to me, in which actual and horrible cannibalism is even now a most important element. Instead of progressing, the Negro Republicans have gone back to the lowest type of African barbarism. This is stated by Chambers' Encyclopedia. A land of continuous revolutions, according to the Encyclopedia Britannica. Boy, let me tell you something. You see propaganda? You can't beat propaganda. Only way you could beat it is with propaganda of your own. Right? In the chat room, I'm getting a lot of activity in the chat room. Let's see if I can get through this. Erzuliism says they cheated. They have the cheat code. Kevin Care 42 said, look what's going on with Rona. Italy is going into another lockdown. I did not know that. The United States just passed 500,000 deaths. I did know that. Yet the so-called shithole countries are doing better. The problem is not black. But it's not black people, but the Muzungus. Wherever they go, death and destruction follows. Absolutely. One silver lining is that their population is drying up. KW Dawn 7 says Urugu's weapons cannot save them. They don't have the muscle. Once the African collective gets our shit together, it's a wrap for the white hegemonic society. System. Right? The vampire, KW Dawn 7 goes on to say, the vampire dies once it can no longer suck the blood. Right? Kevin Care says to KW Dawn 7, they also do not have the numbers. Their propaganda is no longer having an effect. They are fearing that people now are challenging them. Rona was the great equalizer. Erzuliism says, read that back. He says it twice. Kevin Care said, 42 says, Dambala is a snake god. So I think Erzuli wanted me to read back this part here. Official speculation, I guess that's speculation, judicial murder, and other corruption of every kind underlie the forms and titles of civilized government. The religion, nominally Christian, is largely Vodou or serpent worship, in which actual and horrible cannibalism is even now a most important element. Instead of progressing, the Negro Republicans have gone back to the lowest type of African barbarianism. That's according to the Chambers Encyclopedia. It goes on to say a land of continuous revolutions, Encyclopedia Britannica. I've never heard that snake thing before, personally. But Kevin Care 42 says that Dambala, Erzuli, is Dambala something you hear in Vodou in Haiti? Erzuliism says Dambala is the snake god of creations. Okay. A fair illustration of their system of election is exemplified in the so-called election of Nord Alexis in 1902. Being in control of the government forces and not having been known as an aspirant for the presidency, upon the assembling of the National Assembly, Alexis demanded that he should be elected president. To his repeated demands, the National Assembly paid little attention. On the eve of his so-called election, his troops on the field surrounded the palace, falling into firing groups. In the palace, preparations for a banquet were in progress. Entering the National Assembly, he noted that its members could elect him president and go to the banquet or face the firing squads being formed in the yard. He was elected by acclamation. This is but one of hundreds of illustrations of the hollow pretense of free government in this island. An election means nothing but a revolution flowing with blood. It is a battle or a massacre and this has been practically a continuous proposition ever since the French evacuation. The government is a despotism, pure and simple, which fattens upon the blood of an ignorant people, and is only a hard pretense of free government. You see, I wish Haitian folks in the country of Haiti could hear what I'm reading, because sometimes I think that sometimes people need to get angry. Kevin Care mentioned this earlier. Sometimes our people need to get angry. They need to hear the insults. But they need to turn that anger not into some emotional thing, but into something strategic. Into something strategic. I saw Onita say from the pro-black perspective say something on Twitter recently that I've been said before and I agree with wholeheartedly. One of the things about white folks is that they fear retribution. So a lot of the stuff that they keep up with, they keep doing over and over, is because they know, as Kevin K and others in the chat room have said, if we come together and get our shit together, woe be unto them. Now, the problem we would have, and this is why I'm hell on the religious, is that the religious are going to be on some bullshit. And to that, I refer you guys to what happened in Haiti in 1803, or the years leading up to the Haitian Revolution. You get rid of those traitors. You understand? I saw a lady on Twitter, I don't remember her name, I think she's following the pro-black perspective, and she said something like, I don't care about religion, do you, and all that. No, I care, because when the time comes, that those same religious folks will sell us down the river. You gotta care. And then she also says she's a Pan-Africanist. Well, if you believe in that one thing, you gotta be concerned about the religions, and that's why I talk about them so much. It is gradually and surely degenerating, and its conditions must ultimately become worse. Read the record of its unstable and gory governmental life. 1804, Dessalines crowned as emperor. 1806, and by the way, if you guys see anything you disagree with here, put it in the chat room. I'll touch on it. 1806, he is assassinated. War between Haiti and San Domingo. 1807, Christophe becomes king on the title of Henry I. There's war. 1811, Pétion, president of Southern Part, Civil War. 1820, Boyer declared regent for life. After tremendous insurrection and flow of blood, Christophe commits suicide. 1843, Boyer deposed and exiled after revolution. 1844, Rivareri exiled after 1 year. There's war. 1845, Guerrera in office 1 year. 1845, Piero abdicated. 1846, Riche proclaimed president, died in 1 year. 1847, Soliloquy declared emperor after many wars and bloodshed, exiled in 1859. 1858 to 1859, Geffrard, president until 1867, then exiled. I want to point out too that while all this is going on here, there's still the carrying out of slavery in the Americas. 1856-67, dreadful revolution, where Salnave revolts, takes refugees from British consulates and kills them. Bravo. English ship drives them out and helps Geffrard. Geffrard banished, Salnave made president with a new constitution, revolt suppressed amidst torrents of blood. 1868 to 70, continual revolution, Salnave massacres his enemies, proclaims himself emperor, is finally defeated and shot. 1870-74, Nisage Sage completed his 4 years. 1874, Dominique seized the government and after bloody revolution, exiled in 1876. 1876, Canal, after bloody revolution, seizes power. After many revolutions, he is expelled in 1879. 1879, Salomon re-elected 1866. 1888, Salomon deposed and exiled. Civil war between Hippolyte and Legitime placed in office for 1 year and exiled. 1889 to 96, Hippolyte, after many insurrections, died in office, supposed to be poisoned. 1896, Simone Sam, president, trouble with Germany, numerous disorders until 1899. I'm curious to know what the trouble with Germany was. But I know that didn't the U.S. get involved in that as well? In 1900, Sam takes all the funds and leaves the country. 1902, General Nord Alexis proclaimed president. 1908, Nord Alexis retired by revolution. Powers sent warships to stop massacre. 1911, Cincinnatus Leconte, proclaimed president, killed in 1912. Tancredi, appointed president, killed in 1913. Michael Oresti, proclaimed president, was retired by revolution January 1914. 1914, Oresti Zamor assumed the presidency February 8, 1914, and at last accounts was still alive, right? So again, this paper was written around this time. In other words, the constitutional office for a president in Haiti is 7 years. President Salomon, who held office from 1879 to 1886, is apparently the only Haitian president to fill out his term of office. He was killed, however, within 2 years after his re-election for a second term in 1886. Now, of course, they don't tell you what was going on in the time that led to all this, turmoil, right? But again, that's how propaganda works. It's supposed to make the Haitian people look bad. The Haitian people have to counter, right, with their own truths. A writer occupying a high position in the Haitian government, am I right? Yeah. Has lately put forth a masterpiece of special pleading in defense of his government. Any defense of this kind is idle. The island is a land of despotism and wicked government, which is increasing and not decreasing in its terror. By the way, it sounds to me that this, I think it was a governor, right? It sounds to me this governor is setting up the narrative for the U.S. to invade Haiti. Does it sound the same to you guys? All right. Within a month, it has reeked with blood under the throes of one of its almost continuous revolutions. Our government has been again compelled to intervene and save the lives of many of the parties engaged in this internecine war. A number of times, by reason of this situation, war has been almost precipitated between the Haitian government and the European nations. The action of the German government is fresh in the minds of our people, and the warships of Great Britain and France are only too frequent in the harbors of Haiti, protecting their subjects, demanding redress for grievances and saving human life. This means sooner or later that the irresponsible government of the Republic of Haiti will commit the act which will involve us, under the first clause, an original application of the Monroe Doctrine. It seems that if it was not for the Monroe Doctrine, backed by the strong hand of this government, this island would be under the control of a European nation. Now you go to a dumb redneck savage in America, and you start talking about this stuff, and you mention to them the waterways and the passages, right? For ships and commerce, etc. Who do you think is going to enroll in that army to go and attack Haiti? Right? In the chat room. Azuliism says Damballa is the snake god of creations. He says, see the propaganda? They want us away from the snake. Kevin Care42 says, speaking of serpent worship, look at those snake handlers of the Southern Methodist Church. Azuliism says the same way the hospital emblem is two snakes. In voodoo, Damballa created humans. Understood. KW7 says the president of Ghana told Switzerland to kick rocks with regards to receiving any more exports of cocoa beans for chocolate. This is the direction that the rest of the African world should follow. The Zuliism, still talking about the snake, says the snake is very important in African and indigenous black society. That I know, especially in West Africa. Damballa is said to be the sky father and the primordial creator of all life. Kevin Care42 says to KW7, a lot of the Francophone countries are taking their gold out of France. Azuliism says right now the Haitian people alone cannot do it. The whole Caribbean, including black Americans, are supposed to do that. Kevin Care says to Azuliism, agreed. We are all we got. The FBA and A dunces can go kick rocks. And, that's the thing that I know. I don't want to get into this huge segue here, but that's the thing that really irks me about Tariq Nasheed. Like, you're out here and you're making money off of an 1804 documentary. At the time, you're playing nice with Haitians, right? Bello and others, right? And you're talking about how beautiful the country is, this, that, and the other. But then, when you switch up your hustle, right, you realize that there's a space for a black Alex Jones, right? Because there's this underlying, I guess, dislike or distrust of other black folks by American blacks, right? You switch it up and now you're dissing Haitians left and right. You're lying about people not being from other African countries or satellites or whatever. You're lying about them not being mistreated in America. I saw a guy talking some nonsense on Twitter, and I said to him, I said, dude, talk to any Haitian that came to America in the 90s and ask them and I'm not just talking about children, I'm talking about adults even. Ask them how they were treated in America. Oh, I know nothing about Haitians being mistreated. And this fellow ghetto intellectual comes in, and I think it was ghetto intellectual, comes in and say, yeah, of course you don't remember. Because you guys only feel like, folks come and mistreat black Americans, which is nonsense. Right? The person, whoever it was, did have to come back and say, well, I'm aware that black Americans can be just as vindictive as others, right? But this is the problem. We got folks like the Tariq Nasheeds who have the sway of people. I don't care what no one tells me. The Yvette Carnels have the sway of people. Whether it's just online or not, eventually, whatever happens online will seep into what's going on out here. And like Erzuliism said, Haiti can't do this thing on its own. The time has changed. Haiti has been thrown into a deep hole. I'm sorry to say this. It takes all of us to pull her out of it, and we have the proximity to do it. And again, I go back to the original question that no one has really answered. As African people outside of the continent, what do we do with those satellite nations of Haiti and Jamaica, the Bahamas, etc.? In this plight of creating an African nation, do we give up those smaller places? And I'm going to tell you, because I know I'm from the region, them folks ain't giving that up. The most we can do now is try to build a stronger Africa. This is my opinion, but you share yours. We got to build a stronger Africa to give us some power in the world. Like Frederick Douglass said of Haitians back in his day, Haitians got respect from people when they came around. They got respect because of what Haiti had done in 1804. This is what we got to be working towards. I'm going to continue this paper in a minute. Let me take a quick station ID and try grab something to drink. I'll be back on the other side.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
This is DAX. You tune into the Harsh Reality Podcast, providing you with social commentary on the news affecting our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-black perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Also, you guys make sure to check out the Queen's Council podcast as well. All right. Ah, yes, refreshment. Great. So let's continue. Let's pursue this investigation and consider further the moral and religious condition of this island, almost part of our shoreline. Religion is but a pretense. The worship of the green snake and the control of the voodoo are everywhere prevalent. The island has degenerated from its once highest state, and there is no pretense but what the Papaloi and the Mamaloi are as potent as many of the figures in its life. I haven't heard Papaloi and Mamaloi in years. Someone posts what Papaloi and Mamaloi means in the chat room. It seems to be true that on any night, the horrid rites of the voodoo can be witnessed in the heart of the capital of Haiti, surrounded by the soldier in the uniform of the Haitian government. In the book mentioned, the statement is denied, and the assertion is made that Haiti has been slandered by the book writers and the magazine makers by, quote, unscrupulous writers and travelers, end of quote. This assertion is unbelievable. I do not quote Spencer St. John, the English minister who resided in this island for many years, who states in detail the horror of despotism which governs the island, and who gives the details of the dreadful practice of the voodoo, and who charges child stealing and cannibalism to these people. I will leave him out of the controversy entirely and quote only a few of the many other proofs, says Stephen Bonsall in the American Mediterranean. Quote, a man, of course, a general, is in prison for treason or a determinant of funds. This is a delicate way they speak of stealing in Haiti when they will speak of it at all. It is a question of such minor importance simply whether the man shall live or die, that the president will not defer it to the Papaloi or the voodoo priest who lives in the hills behind the city. So he drops a mannequin of clay upon the floor. If it breaks, the man dies. If it remains intact, then he lives as long as the noisome atmosphere of a Haitian prison will let him. Again, the doubt. The president would draw a line across the floor of his sanctum and then pitch mannequins, this time made of wood and attired in the gaudy glory of Haitian generals. The puppets passed the line, it meant one thing. If they lagged behind, it meant another. And so the state papers were fashioned and the presidential decrees inspired in Haiti. But of course, upon the graver questions in the Papaloi and the Mamaloi, the high priest and high priestess of the voodoo sect sat in judgment. The Papaloi of Guinea, Coast Prophet, with his fetish worship and his Congo prayers, is the one solid, substantial fact in Haiti. Around him turn Haitian life and politics. In some administrations, the doors of the Black House have not been as wide open to these prophets of the night as they were while Nord Alexis ruled. But never have they been closed exempt in the reign of the mulatto Jaffrad some 40 years ago. And this was a short and little day and extended with exile to Jamaica, where under the guidance of intelligent and sympathetic white men, the Afro-American is accomplishing more perhaps than anywhere else. Let's read that one more last time, right? Under the guidance of intelligent and sympathetic white men, the Afro-American is accomplishing more perhaps than anywhere else. When you're the ADOS and FBA crew, what you're saying is that due to these white folks, and in fact, white folks are telling you that you can, you could thumb your noses at Haitians or you know, Caribbeans or West Africans or what have you. They're telling you it's largely because of your proximity to them. The cannibalistic feed is only indulged in on rare occasions and at long intervals, and is always shrouded in mystery and hedged about with every precaution against interlopers. For, be their African ignorance ever so dense, their carnal fury ever so unbridled, the papaloy and mamaloy, the head men and head women worshippers never seem to forget that in these vile excesses there should perhaps be found excuse enough for the interference of the civilized world to save the people of the Black Republic from the further degradation which awaits them. Within the last 15 years, human victims have been sacrificed to the great god Voodoo in the National Palace of Haiti. Last February, there was assembled in the National Palace what might justly be called a Congress of Serpent Worshippers. During the life of MME Nord, Alexis Nord, which came to an end in October 1908, not a week passed, but what a meeting of the voodoo practitioners was held in the executed mansion, and her deathbed was surrounded by at least a score of these witch doctors. I want to point out something to you guys before I read the next thing. When I was a kid, right, in the early 80s, there used to be on television a lot of black and white films like Tarzan, right? That showed, you know, that showed a white version of voodoo or obia, as we would say. And, you know, in its day, those images are what scared white children, right? The fear of the cannibal, these cannibal. And so when you read these papers, they rethread those ideas. They rethread those ideas. And the thing, again, when we talk about propaganda, when you rethread these ideas and you create that fear, and you let people know these people are around them is the control to your commerce, how you eat. They're so close to where you live, what they're doing might spill over on your land. It's very easy to then go in and try to destroy these nations. But here's my question to you guys. Why hasn't America outright gone in and destroyed Haiti? Why hasn't America outright gone in and destroyed Haiti? In the chat room, the pro-black perspective says all of us need to pull her out. That's exactly it. That's what Azulism is saying. Everyone is thinking the same thing. We all got to get together and pull her out. Azulism says FBA and ADOS want to fight for the crumbs of capitalism. Pro-black perspective says we don't give them up. We build on continent first. Kevin Kerf, well, see, let's have an honest discussion about that sentiment. When you look at Haiti right now, for example, even Jamaica or wherever in the Caribbean, right? Like, but again, we're talking about Haiti. Can you go to Haitians right now and say, let's build in the continent first before we build here? Kevin Care 42 says Tariq Yvette Tone are all grifters with dumbass followers. I remember this one done saying that when Columbus came to America, he saw black people. Columbus never set foot in North America. The pro-black perspective says you need a bump for the Queen's Council. Trust me, I've asked. Believe you me, I have asked, and I cannot get it. And I've been thinking about asking some of the other sisters to do the bump for me, but I've asked, believe me. Kevin Care 42 says, LOL, Tariq is a demagogue. Kevin Care 42 says, we have to connect with our people in the United States. SANS, A-Done since an FBA. Africa and the Caribbean, we are nothing without each other. You can snap one twig, but try snapping many twigs together. Kevin Care 42 says, Haiti is the phoenix that will rise and shine again. He says that to Zuliism. Zuliism, who's Haitian, by the way, says, I hope so, bro, but I don't know if I'm going to live to see it. No, well, chances are we won't live to see it. But the work that we do here will be the work that creates it. Zuliism says, Papa Loy equals chief priest of Voodoo. Mama Loy is Voodoo priestess. Zuliism asks an important question. Has the African continent as a whole done anything for us? Kevin Care 42 says there was no need for cannibalism in any part of Africa. Food grows everywhere. Coming from a continent like Europe, where it is cold most of the year, food will be scarce. Well, we know these savages hate each other, right? To continue, it says Ober in the wake of Columbus. The serpent is the deity of the Voodoos, and he is represented by a high priest called the Papa Loy and a priestess, the Mama Loy, meaning the father and mother king. The demands are absolute, and no sectary dare disobey them. In this lies their menace to good government. And it is well known that even some of the rulers of Haiti have been dominated by them. The worship of the serpent is carried on as secretly as possible. The sectaries are bound by oaths of secrecy, and the incantations take place in the night. The serpent is consulted through the priests or priestesses, and the devotees then indulge in dancing and song, generally ending in the grossest forms of debauchery. Now, I've never heard that person. And I come from a place that has a sizable Haitian population. We've never seen no shit like that. Frudu in the English in the West Indies says, but this is not the worst. Immorality is so universal that it almost ceases to be a fault, for a fault implies an exception, and in Haiti it is the rule. Young people make experiment of one another before they will enter into any closer connection. So far, they are not worse than in our own English islands, where the custom is equally general, but behind the immorality, behind the religiosity, there lies active and alive the horrible revival of the West African superstitions, the serpent worship, the child sacrifice, and the cannibalism. There's no room to doubt it. A missionary assured me that a missionary assured you? Come on. A missionary assured me that an instance of it occurred only a year ago within his own personal knowledge. The facts are notorious. A full account was published in one of the local newspapers, and the only result was that the president imprisoned the editor for exposing the country. A few years ago, persons guilty of these infamies were tried and punished. Now they are left alone because to prosecute and convict them would be to acknowledge the truth of the indictment. Rear Admiral Chester further says, no accurate history of Haiti can be written without reference to the horrible sorcery called the religion of voodoo, which was introduced into the country with the slaves from Africa. Its creed is that the god voodoo has the power usually ascribed to the Christian's Lord, and that he shows himself to his good friends, the Negroes, under the form of a non-venomous snake, and transmits his power through a chief priest or priestess. These are called either king and queen, master or mistress, or generally as Papa Loy and Mama Loy. Principal act of worship consists of a wild dance, attended by grotesque gesticulations, which leads up to the most disgraceful orgies. I don't know about y'all, but that don't sound too bad to me. But anyway, a secret oath binds all the voodoos, on the taking of which the lips of the neophyte are usually touched with warm goat's blood, which is intended to inspire terror. He promises to submit to death should he ever reveal the secrets of the fraternity, and to put to death any traitor to the sect. It is affirmed, and in no doubt is true, that on special occasions a sacrifice is made of a living child, or the quote-unquote goat without horns, as it is called when cannibalism in its worst form is indulged. So I want to stop and ask this question of my good friend Azuliism here. Have you ever heard of these practices in your home country? Right? Have you ever heard of this in your country? I'm telling you, I'm from a country with a good, sizable Haitian population. I've never heard nor seen that in my time. Under the circumstance of taking the oath of allegiance, it should cause no surprise that the Haitians claim that this is not true and defy any white man to produce evidence of guilt. But notwithstanding, no one can read the horrible tales published by one of the British ministers to Haiti, which described in detail the revolting practices of the Voodoos, together with the proofs he brings to substantiate the truth of the allegations, without coming to the reluctant conclusion that cannibalism is resorted to in these meetings. Of course, no white man could live on the island after having given testimony leading to the conviction of culprits in such cases, and therefore the Negroes' demand for proof can never be satisfied. Indeed, it is said that even some presidents who have openly discouraged the voodoo practices have come to violent deaths from this cause. The character of the meetings of the Voodoos, which take place in secluded spots in the thick woods, is well known, and I have been given a description of one of them from an eyewitness who was an officer of our Navy, which no one could hear without a shudder. He states in brief that one day while out hunting, he abruptly ran into a camp of worshippers, which was located on a lonely spot in the woods, and the horrors he there saw made an indelible impression upon his mind. When his presence was discovered, he was immediately seized by a frenzied crowd of men and women, and for some minutes there did not seem to be a question but that his life was to be forfeited. But the Papaloi called a halt and a council, apparently to determine what action should be taken. And while this was in session, a handful of coin, judiciously scattered, diverted the thoughts of the Negroes for the time being from their captive. The usual sacrifice of a live white rooster was now brought on, seeing which the people were called back to their worship, and the ceremonies went on in his presence. In the horrible struggle which took place for possession, the bird was torn literally to pieces, and he had no doubt that its accompaniment, the quote-unquote goat without horns, would soon follow. While this was in progress, his presence seemed to be forgotten, and watching a good opportunity, he ran for his very life, not stopping until he reached the protection of his ship. Again, propaganda. I think I talked to Azuliism about this before, but I'll put this out there to the rest of you. If you guys know of any Papaloi or Mamaloi or Voodoo, Haitian descent, have them jump on the show. All right, reach out to me. I'd like to have them come on the show. One of the things I would do with them is have them listen to this broadcast. And then I'd like to talk to them about the practice, ancient and modern, and if any of this seems like truth to you. In the chat room, Kevin Care42 says there was no, Kevin Care42 says, look at the early colonizers. There was a winter where they had food, shortages. They fed on each other. That's absolutely true. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, even during the Dust Bowl, which is in more recent times, which is probably around the time of this paper, they were eating each other even then. Kevin Care42 says morality does not exist with the Muzungus. They are nothing more than walking lies. Goes on to say, remember too that Benjamin Franklin used to go to cemeteries at night dig up bodies to experiment on them. Zuliism says, but do you see the disparaging and slander they are doing? Anything these Urugos tell you, do the opposite. I always said, absolutely do the... If they tell you to shun your West African origin, do the opposite. Even in the last conversation we had about Asusu, right? You may want to reconsider using these folks as bank and go back to the Asusu way of doing things. Whatever they tell you, do the opposite. Kevin K42 says, read this in the book Medical Apartheid. Oh, he read this in the book Medical Apartheid. You know, it's funny, I had a conversation with a sister earlier today about that book Medical Apartheid and about this other book. What's the name of this other book? Fatal Invention. Have you guys ever read the book Fatal Invention? I don't know if you've ever read that book Fatal Invention about the scientific racism and how they include certain things in research. It's like scientific research that's going to have an outcome that's going to be skewed against us as far as black folks are. But Zuliism says, I'm not saying that people avenues were doomed for bad selfish reasons, but I never heard of what they are describing. Black Excellence says the movie The Serpent and the Rainbow was pure propaganda. It was about the white savior. My guy that I loved in the movie was the so-called villain. He was the hero of the movie. Zuliism says, first of all, the correct term is Hogan and Mambo. The correct term for what is Hogan and Mambo. Is that Papaloy Mamaloy you're talking about? Black Excellence says, remember the NYPD Cannibal Cop. All right. To continue. Says Pritchard and Where Black Rules White. But there is one thing common to the whole country of which every Haitian denies the existence. Vado is the one thing which they declare they have not. They tell you there is no snake worship. Azuliism. Wink, wink. I'm just kidding. They tell you there is no snake worship. I'm speaking of the higher classes within the bounds of the Republic. But when you betray certain knowledge of the subject, they admit that those sacrifices and savage dances may take place in other departments. No such things are known in that one in which you are at the moment find yourself. Thus in Jacmel, they told me I should find voodoo in Port-au-Prince and the plain of cul-de-sac. Port-au-Prince, as I was actually returning from witnessing a sacrifice within the limits of the town, I was advised to go to the Cape, where alone such rites flourish. And at the Cape, they told me to take ship for Jacmel, but there I would assuredly find him. As a matter of plain fact, the traveler riding across the country in any direction is quite likely to come suddenly in view of the ceremonies in full swing. He will see the telltale dances, the faces smeared in blood, perhaps even the body of the black goat, the sacred sacrifice. So that's something I want our researchers and our writers to do, and it's something we can do as just regular folks. Start doing the research on the savagery of these savages in Europe, right? I know some of our esteemed scholars have talked about it before, and we need to regularly put articles about that stuff out there for our people to see and to understand these people that we're dealing with. We're dealing with savages, but they will have you believe you're the savage. In the wake of Columbus, Ober further says, it may bear away the palm of being the most foul-smelling, dirty, and consequently fever-stricken city in the world. Everyone throws his refuse before his door so that heaps of manure and every species of rubbish encumber the way. As to the streets, they do not seem to have been mended for the last 100 years. The Haitians have a saying, God spoiled them and God will mend them. As the bon Dieu only helps those who help themselves. And as the Haitians have no desire to help themselves in the way of making or repairing their roadways, their condition is frightful beyond description. The gutters are open, pools of stagnant and fetid water obstruct the streets everywhere, and receive constant accessions from the inhabitants using them as cesspools and sewers. There are few good buildings in town, and none in the country. The torch of the incendiary being constantly applied, and no encouragement offered to rebuild through protection of the government or local enterprises. Buildings destroyed by earthquake or fire are never replaced, and the nearest approach to rebuilding is seen in the slab shanty leaning against the ruined walls of a large structure demolished. So when I read that, it makes me think about what I've talked about in the past. When I've talked about like Booker T. Washington, I've talked about education. The education that you have in your locality, in your locale, is an education that's supposed to help you, that's supposed to not just help you, but push you to solving your local problems, solving the community problems. Azulism is from Haiti. Is the education there a part of aside from the powers messing with Haiti, which we understand, is there an education problem in Haiti where folks are not taking it upon themselves to solve some of their more local problems? Kevin Care 42 says, remember during the dark ages of Europe, they used to throw feces and urine out the windows. The only time these European cities were clean was when it rained. Bathing and washing clothes was ... Rear Admiral Colby M. Chester, in his article on quote-unquote Haiti, a degenerating island, further says, of the 11 ports of Haiti open to foreign commerce, Cape Haitien and Port-au-Prince are the largest and most progressive. Cape Haitien, and if I mispronounce it, not forgive me. Cape Haitien, or the Cape, as it's commonly called, is situated on the northwestern coast, at the foot of a hill that slopes back to the sea, with most picturesque surroundings. It has a, by the way, Azulism, if you've been to these parts of Haiti, let me know. I know Haiti is big, so, but if you've been to, or if you're from any of these areas, let me know. It has a commodious harbor and supports a population of about 30 to 40,000 people. Under the French, it was the capital of the colony, and its wealth, splendor, and luxury gained for it the name of Little Paris. But now the structures erected by the French in colonial days are a mass of ruins. The parks overgrown with tropical weeds, the fountains choked with debris, the gutters filled with filth, all producing pestilential emanations from which foreigners speedily run away if they are forced into its environment. Port-au-Prince, the present capital of the Republic, as well as its largest and most important city, is likewise most picturesquely located at the foot of hills where one may escape from its blistering and filthy streets to mountain resorts that would be popular if located in almost any country of the world. Unlike Cape Haitien, the city is cut off from the trade winds to which this island owes so much of its salubriousness, and therefore it is hot. But still, the traveler caught in the town may frequently felicitate himself when he reads that cities in our own country have higher temperatures by 10 to 15 degrees than is usually found here. The city is well supplied with the most delicious mountain water, and if its 60,000 inhabitants use it as freely as do Americans, it might be as clean as nature made it. As it is, it may well hold the palm for being the most filthy, foul-smelling, and consequently fever-stricken city in the world. The gutters of the streets, which may be said to cover the whole road beds, are filled with stagnant waters and are used as cesspools by the people. But for the torrential rains which pour down the mountainsides and carry off all the filth, into the beautiful bay, even a Haitian could not live there. But the bay, thus polluted, is quite as much of a menace to health as the city itself. During the visits of American men of war to the port, most of the time is spent in keeping the people from pestilential vapors which emanate from the sea itself. The water of the harbor is so bad that it cannot be used even for scrubbing the decks of the ships. Froude, in the English in the West Indies, further says, clearly this paper is just a dumping on of Haiti, right? The question is, let's counter it with the positive stories coming out of Haiti. No one can foretell the future of the Black Republic, but the present order of things cannot last in an island so close under the American shores. If the Americans forbid any other power to interfere, they will have to interfere themselves. But if they find Mormonism an intolerable blot upon their escutcheon, they will have to put a stop in some way or other to cannibalism and devil worship. You remember the guy from the 700 Club? Did he die? What's the man from the 700 Club who was talking all that shit about Haiti and the earthquakes and they sold their souls to the devil? This sounds like he got this and put it into his handbook, right? Meanwhile, the 90 years of Negro self-government have had their use in showing what it really means. And if English statesmen, either to save themselves trouble or to please the prevailing uninstructed sentiment, insist on extending it, they will be found when their accounts are made up to have been no better friends to the unlucky Negro than their slave trading forefathers. Mining is largely an unknown occupation in Haiti. Agriculture was languished, although it is true that in 1912 the coffee crop increased and concessions have been made to some timber enterprises, but little has been done in the way of enterprise and action in this island, situated athwart the commerce of the world. If this condition was sporadic and lasted but for a time, it would be a proposition for consideration. When the island is lapsing practically into degeneracy, when the government is a continuous revolution and the state of religion is at the proofs indicated in this paper are not the peace and safety of this country constantly in peril by reason of the condition of this island, so near to us and so important to our life. These statements are not pleasant. They are not made for any sinister purpose. Once you read that, you already know it's made for a sinister purpose, right? But rather to bring to the attention of our people a condition of affairs at our very doors, which is vital and increasing importance to this nation. It is easy to apply the Monroe Doctrine as to non-interference on the part of European nations with our hemisphere. The great question is our own position with the nations of this hemisphere, which may offend against the doctrine which conserves the peace and safety of our government. Here's a question for you guys. Why did the European nations go along with, or at least seemingly go along with, the idea of the Monroe Doctrine? Is it because the European nations realized that these trade routes are important to them and so they had to play ball? Is it also because, or is it just because America had military might that the Europeans didn't want to mess with? Or is it a combination of all of those things, right? America drew the line and said, if you're bad, cross it. We'll cut out your ability to receive imports, ability to have any exports. We'll destroy you militarily. Is that the sole reason why Europe agreed? The great question is our own position with the nations of this hemisphere, which may offend against the doctrine which conserves the peace and safety of our government. With the world movement of today, with the enormous changes which have taken place by reason of the building of the Isthmian Canal, It is idle to say that our peace and safety can be preserved if we sit by and allow an international nuisance to bring upon this country the interference of the nations of Europe and compel us by blood and treasure to enforce the original application of our doctrine of European non-interference. Free Cuba and the free Central and South American states attest the fact that one of the great fundamental desires of this republic is that it shall be surrounded by free people and governments. Is it not apparent, however, that the time has arrived when the conditions in and along the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean Sea can no longer be tolerated? This guy is calling for war. These seas, for many years, have been silent seas. The conditions are now reversed, and the great trade routes of the world will pass about these islands over these seas. And they will be noisy with the whirl of the propeller and bright with the sails of ships. This island will be in the midst of a worldwide traffic and commerce, whose freedom and non-interference are practically guaranteed by this country. The reason why America doesn't go in and demolish Haiti militarily is because it's easier to keep it in a state of imbalance. It's easier to promote sellouts and traitors who will guide Haiti deeper and deeper into the hole. Can the peace and safety of this country be preserved unless we adopt the measures which are the inalienable rights of every nation? The world, with the shortening of trade routes, touching of nations, and the demands for sure commercial conditions, is arriving at the thought that there is no inalienable right on the part of any people to control any region to the detriment and inquiry of the world at large. This is not a covert statement that under the Monroe Doctrine, this nation can take control of the affairs of other states of this hemisphere when the policy of that country does not suit our theories and ideas. Line drawn. It means, however, that when a country of this hemisphere persists in being an international nuisance, when it shows to the world a condition of general degeneracy by which it practically gives notice that there will be no improvement, that this government under the Monroe Doctrine will adopt measures for its own peace and protection and for the preservation of the trade and commerce of these seas, which are practically within its commercial life. The Monroe Doctrine, I repeat, is nothing more nor less than a doctrine of self-preservation. To permit the condition of the island of Haiti to exist without interference or protect on our part is illogical. Under the Monroe Doctrine, we practically say to European nations that they shall not for any cause lay their hands heavily upon a country in this hemisphere. What a ballsy move. I mean, what a damn ballsy move. At the same time, in accordance with the views of many people of our day, we ourselves have the right to do nothing. Hence, unless we interfere or permit the European nations to interfere, there must be a continuance of the status of that country. The original object of the Monroe Doctrine was to prevent the control and colonization of the independent states of this hemisphere by European nations. As I have before stated, this does not mean that without any orderly or stable government, this government should occupy the position of suzerainty or implied control. No American believes that great states like Argentina, Brazil, or Chile, with their stable governments, should be under our implied or actual control. Well. Still, everyone who understands the conditions of the day believes that a logical corollary of the Monroe Doctrine demands that the nations of the hemisphere shall in their governmental affairs do nothing which would infringe upon or impair the peace and safety of the American government. Since the construction of the canal, this condition has been intensified. The government is practically a trustee for the world in its possession of the Isthmian Canal. Is it conceivable that with our enormously increased interest we should sit idly by and allow the peace and safety of this country to be interfered with by a country which is a plague spot to the nations of the earth? It's a great part of American commerce, and a large part of the traffic of the world will be through the American seas between the walls of this canal and by the shores of this land. Notice he calls the Caribbean Sea and the Gulf the American seas, right? He talked about it earlier, but he comes back to claim it. If you ain't claiming power, you ain't about nothing. These seas will become more populous with commerce than any other section of the world. There'll be a gathering place and crossing point for the East and the West, and their possession, either forcibly or otherwise, will carry with it more potentiality than the possession of any other body of water on the face of the earth. Listen to the power that's in your geographic region, but you're not wielding that power. It will be absolutely necessary that the outposts of the canal shall be in the hands of strong and stable governments, and it cannot be thought that the harbors necessary for that commerce and the islands by which it will pass, and in whose broad bays it will be compelled to anchor, shall be rife with revolution and dangerous to that commerce. These folks are about their paper. You're not messing with their money. You're not going to mess with their power. Is it reasonable that this country, which is practically guardian of this commerce, will allow a condition to obtain which will be a daily menace to this great American commerce, and surely bring about the complications which must interfere with the peace and safety of this country? This great traffic must be clear and uninterfered with, and the responsibility is upon us to see that within these seas, the rights of 100 million people and their unborn descendants shall not be interfered with by countries which are not able to preserve a stable government for themselves. The government believes that the fundamental principles of a country's life should be freedom and consent of the governed. Yet it is idle to speak of the consent of the governed in an island which has never known anything but a blood-stained despotism. Ex-President Roosevelt in quote-unquote Chile and the Monroe Doctrine says it is untruthful folly to assert that it is possible for the United States or for any other great nation to treat an anarchic and wrongdoing country on a footing of real and full equality, on which I have above spoken, as representing that plane of conduct which should characterize all the dealings between my nation and your own, and my nation and certain other South American republics. I hope, and I am reasonably confident, that the less advanced nations of the New World will in their turn gradually advance just as my nation and yours, as well as certain others, have already advanced. As soon as any nation in the course of its advance reaches a position of self-respecting strength and orderly liberty and achieve power to do and to exact justice, then it should at one step out from any position of tutelage in any respect. So here's what America does. They make sure you don't reach this step. It's bullshit speak. They make sure you don't reach this step. I'm checking with the chat room. By the way, if you're listening to this show in the playback, you're missing out when you're not here in person. We have some good conversation in the chat room, which, as you can tell, makes these episodes of the podcast, even better. Right? In the chat room, Erzuliism answered my question. He says, huge education problem. Kevin Care 42 says, never an option. It was the Moors, a black man, that introduced baths and showed these Europeans proper hygiene. I mean, for God's sake, look who is spreading the virus, the Rona, sorry. Erzuliism says, must teach Most teach against the black spirituality. Kevin Kerr says, to Azuliism, education is a seed that solves ignorance. One that tree grows, it bears fruit. Azuliism says to that facts. Kevin Kerr 42 says to Azuliism, it is the same problem in my country of Jamaica. Many do not want to get educated, but worship materialism. Azuliism says to Kevin Kerr 42, most of the Caribbean and African continent is like that. And being Caribbean, I could say that's true. Kevin Kerr 42 says Chinua Achebe's book Things Fall Apart was the correction and answer to White Supremacists' The Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. Was it? Kevin Kerr 42 says to Azuliism, social media and the ability to share knowledge will change this kind of ignorance. Guerrilla warfare. First we use it as a shield, then as a sword. Azuliism. Kevin Kerr says to Kevin Kerr 42, yes, but you see what they did to the main character and things fall apart. Kevin Kerr says to Azuliism, gotta read it again. It's been almost 20 years. Azuliism correctly states, spoiler alert, that they drove the main character and things fall apart to suicide. Kevin Kerr says, really sad. You know, this is the rub. This is the rub. These, as Kevin Kerr 42, I think, said earlier, America speaks with a forked tongue to the main world. And, you know, they got this stuff from guys like your boy in the Congo there, from Belgium, Leopold, right? On the face of things, you talk this nice talk and you seem so benevolent. In fact, Leopold was doing this shit around this time, around the time of this paper, right? You speak like you're so benevolent and you just want to help people out. But underneath it, you're doing the most dastardly things, and we can actually learn something from that. You nod your head and you play like, okay, yeah, we're cool. But underneath that, you work real hard as nations, as black nations, to undermine all that shit. The reality of it is we got to bind together and save Haiti. We got to bind together and empower the Caribbean. And then we also, at the same time, Africans on the continent have to empower Africa. The problem is we're in these cycles of just talking about it. So it seems. Now we're not doing the things to change it. And one of the things to change it, I've said this before, I'm gonna have to say it again, is you gotta change the education of our people. Once our people are getting this French education, this English education, and so forth and so on, we will never have the right education that raises up, that puts the battery in our back to raise ourselves up out of our problems. I'm not talking pull yourself up by the bootstraps like these clowns out here talking about. I'm talking about real understanding the climate and the conditions under which our people are living in different places. And after understanding that, then turning around and coming up with solutions that immediately change the condition. We're doing the same unimpactful, quote unquote, remedies for these problems. And we're constantly looking for the foreigners to come in and give us aid and to help us out of our problems. There's things that we can do ourselves as individuals to get the collective out of the problem, and we're not doing it. To continue, a distinguished writer in advocating the abrogations of the Monroe Doctrine speaks of it as if all danger to the South and Central American republics was over. Permit a little plain speaking on this subject, for it is sometimes helpful in the greatest as well as in the small affairs of the world. I believe if it had not been for the promulgation and the enforcement of the Monroe Doctrine by this republic, there would not today be the continent of South America or in Central America a government independent of European control. Let us look at the situation of today throughout the world and ascertain if there is any change in the desires of the nation since the promulgation of the Monroe Doctrine. The earth hunger of the European countries is fiercer than ever in its history. Again, this is the early 1900s. So you had a lot of these places still under colonization. Their vastly increasing populations demand an enlargement of their national life, and the peoples of the European governments demand more food and more labor than their countries can furnish. The great new markets of the world are South and Central America, China, and some parts of Africa. China has been practically delimited into the spheres of influence by the European and the Japanese governments, and Mongolia has been raked from her bosom. What's China doing about that now, though? The gaunt breast of Africa has been seized and marked out for their own by the European governments. The whitening bone, and that's plays a part in why America made that claim too, by the way, right? The whitening bones of Italian, Arab, and Turk in Tripoli, right? The fierce anger of France and Germany only last year over Morocco. The busy colonization plans of Europe and Northern Africa. The strife of the dying Muslim empire. The seizure and occupation of Egypt by England. And the tremendous conflict between Russia and Japan, which in its last analysis was a conflict for territory. All attest that today the earth hunger is not satisfied by the peoples of Europe. I like how Americans talk about Europe like they're separate people, right? I say it solemnly and with all the earnestness with which I can express it, that I believe, were it not for the power of the Monroe Doctrine, within 10 years, excepting Argentina, Brazil, and Chile, there would not be a free and independent government in South America. Their marvelous natural wealth, their splendor of climate, their richness of flora and fauna, and their wealth of precious metals would more surely provoke the desire of the European nations than the gaunt, fever-stricken, the fierce and the fair sunburned wastes of Africa. Those who feel that the Monroe Doctrine is outworn and that it should be abrogated evidently do not remember very modern history. The meaning is illustrated by one of the great ABC nations of the South American continent. Many of us remember the incident as of yesterday, when the revolution against the Republic was inaugurated in Brazil. For the purpose of reestablishing the empire, the Navy of Brazil was in favor of the overturning of the Republic and the restoration of the Braganza family to the head of an imperial Brazilian government. In the harbor of Rio de Janeiro were congregated an assembly of the warships of the monarchies of Europe and the Republic of the United States. The commanders of the European squadrons were in sympathy with the revolutionists and unwilling to do anything which would interfere with the plans of the imperialists. And the imperialists attempted to establish a blockade to carry out their plans of revolution. The American commander, acting under the Monroe Doctrine by direction of our government in Washington, was the only naval commander who objected, and he cleared for action and forced the admiral commanding the imperial forces to desist from his purposes. It must be remembered that this was only in 1893. Again, this paper was written somewhere around 1915, 1914, and happened to the great Republican government of Brazil, our friend and neighbor. Let us take another modern and well-known application. So late as 1894, the British government attempted to force a situation with Venezuela, which would bring about British control of the Orinoco region and practically shut up in British hands the control of one of the greatest rivers of commerce, a region which has imperial potentialities of trade and commercial life. Had it not been for the strong hand of this government, acting through and under the provisions of the Monroe Doctrine, today an important field of commerce, a vast region of South America, a great portion of an independent republic, and the control of a mighty river would be in the grasp the British Empire. You know, sometimes I forget how late the British were still trying to expand their empire. The question of European interference today is not dead. To everyone who reads, there arises the question of the settlement of the position of the great foreign colonies in South America. Every well-informed student of public affairs and international matters is looking forward to the time when friction will develop between the home governments of these colonists and the republics within whose territories they live. So before we get into what Secretary Alney says, I see some activity in the chat room. Kevin Kerr says, don't forget Shark Island. That was a bigger Holocaust than what happened in Germany. The Germans used Shark Island to exterminate Africans, absolutely. Kevin Kerr 42 says, European education is that of fantasy and confusion. Joni Rosenthal, I feel like I've seen that name here before. Have you been here before, Joni Rosenthal? Says, first, we, Haiti, or Haiti, if you will, need to accept accountability. All the issues that are happening in Haiti are identical politics. Is that identical politics or identity politics? For the last 35 years, we had what you call democracy, and it's not working for us. Joni Rosenthal says, yes, they were here before. I thought so. Kevin Kerr 42 says 8 people killed, including 6 Asian women, in shooting spree across 3 Georgia spas. A white man did this today, and they want to say we're savages, right? Kevin Kerr posted a Daily News article, and Kevin Kerr said exactly what I just said, and they say we are the savages, which is wild. You know, but our people, in large part, don't understand who the savages are. Joni Rosenthal, I want to thank you for being here again. I hope Azuliism is still around as well. The people of the United States have learned in the school of experience to what extent the relations of states to each other depend, not upon sentiment nor principle, but upon selfish interest. Y'all guys pay attention to what these white folks are telling you. They will not soon forget that in their hour of distress, all their anxieties and burdens were aggravated by the possibility of demonstrations against their national life on the part of the powers with whom they had long maintained the most harmonious relations. They have yet in mind that France seized upon the apparent opportunity of our civil war to set up a monarchy in the adjoining state of Mexico. They realized that had France and Great Britain held important South American possessions to work from and to benefit, the temptation to destroy the predominance of the Great Republic in this hemisphere by furthering its dismemberment might have been irresistible. From that grave peril, they have been saved in the past and may be saved again in the future through the operation of the sure but silent force of the doctrine proclaimed by President Monroe. To abandon it, on the other hand, disregarding both the logic of the situation and the facts of our past experience, would be to denounce a policy which has proved both an easy defense against foreign aggression and a prolific source of internal progress and prosperity. Y'all hold on one second. I'm back. Sorry about that. All right. We desire to go in peace and equity with the peoples of this hemisphere to that consummation where all will be kindliness and trust between the Republic and other neighbors. Still, the great thought of this Republic is that it is best for all to maintain the Monroe Doctrine in all its virility. With our president, we expressly disclaim any desire of conquest, nor do we wish any suzerainty or control of the stable nations of this hemisphere. Here's where the correct differentiation is lost sight of in the Latin countries. It is idle to speak of the great nations, stable and orderly as they are, as standing on a level with disorderly revolution-ridden despotisms, such as have been discussed and which in many instances obtain in Latin America. This great doctrine is fundamentally necessary to the existence of the peace and safety of this country. Yet we wish the help and assistance of the great and stable nations of South America to carry it to its great fruition. The application of these propositions to the subject under consideration is plain. Whilst this government has no desire for conquest, yet the great advance in the world movement and in the vital commercial affairs of the globe demands that the peace and safety of this hemisphere shall not be necessarily and wickedly broken, and that the peace, happiness, and safety of this nation and the commerce of the world within the bounds of our governmental life shall not be imperiled in the future as they have been in the past. The tremendous impetus which under the world movements of the day has been so potent and plain demands order in all of the affairs and details of its life. The conditions of the times and the dependence of one part of the globe upon the other, brought upon by the easy interchange between the nations, mean that no disorder in that great world commerce will be again lightly tolerated. Under the plainest and fairest interpretation of the Monroe Doctrine, it reaches easily the subject under discussion. Under its original application, it will not allow a situation to obtain which will give the opportunity for foreign nations to interfere in the governmental life of countries of our hemisphere. Under the fundamental meanings of the Monroe Doctrine, it will imperil the peace, safety, and happiness of this country if an island lying at our doors, within touch of our daily life, athwart our greatest line of commerce, shall continue its life of disorder in the future as it has in the past. Again, folks are drawing the line. This position of our country should breed no distrust among our self-respecting and stable neighbors in this hemisphere. We will go along with them hand in hand, and with their assistance help the nations which are weak, and do what we can to place them on eternal foundations of freedom, prosperity, and order, so that they may become part and parcel of this great free brotherhood on the Western Hemisphere. A great writer speaks of the obligation of the doctrine and voices the distrust and suspicion among the nations of the Southern Hemisphere. To this we reply with the pages of history and ask under what government, people, or system that has ever existed since history began to write its pages have there been preserved in their freedom and governmental life so many weak nations as have existed on this hemisphere, side by side with this powerful republic. How about that? How about that? He has cited as cause of distrust California and Mexico. There were life movements, absolutely instinctive in their being and demonstrated by the very existence of this nation. Distinguished writers so frequently discuss the jealousy of the South American nations towards the United States by reason of the Monroe Doctrine. One has gone so far as to give in detail the size and strength of South American dreadnoughts and to deal with immense particularity as to the amount of beef and wheat raised and shipped by these nations. It is true that some jealousy does really exist. That cannot be avoided. The thinking statesmen of the South American countries, however, do not believe in the unjust aggression of the United States. Those of them who know the situation and understand it do not fear the Monroe Doctrine or its consequences. They are professional politicians in South America who fan the embers of distrust for their own uprising and their own purposes. But the great trend of sentiment and thought on the part of the leaders of the great states of South America is not in this direction. I quote the statement of Senor Zabelos of Argentina as a fair indication of the thought of these South America who know the real feeling of our country towards its southern neighbors. Quote, what other countries of America have the same world problems of Panama and Mexico? The latter of the frontier of the United States and the former the throat of the continent itself. They have nothing in common with the problems of the River Plata, or the shores of Brazil, or the coast of Chile. The Monroe Doctrine is necessary today to the United States. The Caribbean Sea washes the coast of the richest part of the United States, and it's necessary that it is dominated by them in order to guarantee the independence and security of the United States. Under these circumstances, when there is constant danger of European intervention, as in the case of Venezuela, the United States said to the powers in accordance with the Monroe Doctrine, quote, you can urge your claims in accordance with international procedure, but you cannot take territory, because if you do, you will have to deal with the armed forces of the United States. Again, line drawn. The powers thereupon became less aggressive and the matter was settled by arbitration. This action of the United States emphasized once more the doctrine that no European power will be permitted to acquire territory on the continent of America. Thoughtful men do not agree with the contention in some directions that the Monroe Doctrine should be enforced under an agreement with South American states. It seems that this would be impracticable. The Monroe Doctrine necessarily is an emergency doctrine. While it is fundamental, the demand for its action is immediate and decisive. It is a doctrine which demands absolute and direct action to make it effective. Very many serious questions arise as to the practicability of the carrying out of any such agreement between the states of South America and the United States. In the first place, the interests of this government are greater than the interests of any other government on this hemisphere. What relative power would this government have as against the other contracting powers? The Monroe Doctrine is a doctrine peculiarly applying to the United States. And this doctrine is divided so that it applies to other governments. Necessarily, the very essence of the doctrine is done away with. Again, it has been the history of international affairs that agreements between nations, diverse in thought, life, sentiment, situation, and race, have never been successful. Here would be an agreement for the enforcement of the doctrine between the Anglo-Saxon and the Latin nations, absolutely different in temperament, and also between nations whose whole financial and local situation is absolutely different from that of the United States. As I get to the end of the paper here, I want you guys write your thoughts in the chat room. What are your thoughts on the Monroe what's this thing called? The Monroe Doctrine and Haiti. What are your thoughts as to the Monroe Doctrine and Haiti? What can be done about this Monroe Doctrine? Suppose, for instance, a question should arise between England and some of the South American states, and that the contracting powers for the maintenance of the Monroe Doctrine will be the United States, Argentina, Brazil, and Chile. Those who know the situation in Argentina would not suppose for a moment that Argentina would oppose England in some controversy as to some minor state, which would be important to the United States, but relatively unimportant to Argentina. This illustration applies at equal force as to the other South American states. You know, it's interesting that America has this struck with Latin America. Think about that for a second, right? The illustration applies with equal force to the other South American states. The money with which these great states are being developed and the population which is largely engaged in developing them come from Europe, and Europe could injure these states financially if they oppose European interests in and about the enforcing of the Monroe Doctrine. This is a mere illustration of the multitude of troubles which would come by an agreement that the Monroe Doctrine should be enforced by a joint action of South American states and the United States. The questions are so absolutely diverse as between the United States and these countries that no unity of action could be brought about as to make the enforcement of the doctrine effective. While this is true, the Monroe Doctrine should not be enforced with a strong hand, but should be carried out in justice, in courtesy, and in fairness between our country and the countries of South America. This honesty and respect obtained among nations just as among men, and by the immutable laws of cause and effect, and the action of this government upon a high plane will surely obtain and hold the respect of the countries of South America. The Monroe Doctrine, within its very nature, is a doctrine which is fundamental and peculiar to the United States. While it should be carried out in justice, the mode, the time, the place, and the manner of its operation should be, and I believe will be, directed and controlled absolutely by the United States. To place it in other hands would be the destruction of the doctrine, which has been vital to this country and to this hemisphere, and caused the weakening of the hands of this government in the direction where international trade and life will demand that our hands should be strong and absolutely free to act decisively in the great international emergencies which arise so unexpectedly and which are fraught with such momentous consequences. Here's a thing that crossed my mind while reading that. Earlier I said the United States, if you're a rational thinking person, will say, hey, let's work with these countries, Haiti, Jamaica, etc., Cuba, these countries that are these very important places within this ocean, right, as far as trade and travel is concerned. But here, you see what they're telling you. The reason why they won't work with these different places because then it's out of their hands. They don't have the control. If only African nations and Caribbean nations will think similarly. And the thing is, America stands to lose the most if it's out of their hands. And they know it. But like our people don't realize this. As KW Dawn and Kevin Care 42 said earlier in this discussion, they said America is losing their ability to wield this power through this military power. I'm not sure of that. That's something to look into and talk about on the show in the future. Right? Saying that they're lacking, I guess, the number of people to do the work. But guess what? You got these Latins, quote unquote Latins, Latin America, they're willing to pick up the arms and do it. The doctrine of Monroe is a doctrine of help and peace. No, it's not. It is true that those who love our country, and by the way, all this talk about keeping America strong and keeping the power in their hands and etc. for their people and for peace and all that. Does America really exhibit peace? Does America really exhibit taking care of her people? So then what is the Monroe Doctrine really about? It is true that those who love our country believe that this republic, quote unquote, looks hopefully to the time when by the voluntary departure of European governments from this continent and the adjacent islands, America shall be wholly American. Still, these governments and their systems are here and are part of the life of this hemisphere. They will surely demand that we preserve order and preserve the safety of the commerce within our sphere. This means absolute order. To bring about this order, this government will not hurt the self-respect or pride of any great and stable nations of our hemisphere. Right there, they're telling you what they're doing. This is why Haiti is not a stable nation. We will work with them along the lines of mutual respect and esteem, touched by the new life which is making them so vital and important as a part of the world affairs of the day. They will understand that the conditions of other days cannot continue, and that the responsibilities brought about by present world conditions demand that our safety and peace, as well as theirs, compel the continued existence of the Monroe Doctrine in its full virility. When this is understood, there will be no distrust. There will be the commingling of nations with the same governmental freedoms. Bullshit. It will be a great brotherhood and the only one of free people and free nations marching onward hand in hand to the consummation of that blessed time when the strong will not oppose the weak, and when filled with mutual esteem, confidence, and regard, and touched by the wondrous, vitalizing life of freedom, the nations of this hemisphere, great and little, Latin and Anglo-Saxon, will show to the world the splendor of freedom in its highest and best development. That's the end of the paper. As I was reading that, I remember where I remember the name Joni Rosenthal from. We were in contact for a while on Facebook and stuff, weren't we? About co-hosting, I believe it was. If I'm wrong, correct me. I'm going to do a quick station ID, and on the other side, I'll read your comments and any last thoughts you have about this paper and the Monroe Doctrine in general. Remember, the question is, how do you feel about the Monroe Doctrine as it is applied to Haiti?
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
This is DAX. You tune into the Harsh Reality Podcast, providing you with social commentary on the news affecting our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-black perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Yes, indeed. Also, check out the Queen's Council podcast, also on KWAZ Radio. In the chat room, Joni Rosenthal says she was talking about identity politics. I'm sorry, I was typing too fast. Azuliism says that he's still here. NYC Beauties is still here, says Manuel Noriega crossed that line, and look what happened to him. Pablo Escobar crossed that line and got put down. Those cartels in Mexico are allowed to do what they do, because if they too cross that line, they are next. A great movie is Clear and Present Danger. Joni Rosenthal says the doctrine didn't affect how Cuba improved their country. NYC Beauty says Monroe Doctrine is about the United States extracting resources from the countries they subjugate, and I'll add to that, basically telling Europe, mind your goddamn business. That's really what the Monroe Doctrine is about. We'll police and do what we gotta do over here. You guys take your ass up out of here and mind your goddamn business. What's going on in Haiti is all carried out by America. And everyone else must mind their goddamn business. So when Haitians are going through what they're going through right now, with the current president that they're dealing with, right? Joni Rosenthal says yes. Yeah, I now remember we did have discussions for a while about that, right? When Haitians are going through what they're going through now, and they're telling you in the streets, look up, because they're trying to get the international world outside of the U.S. and Haiti. They're trying to get everyone to realize what's going on. They're telling you this is the Monroe Doctrine. Look it up, right? This is what's going on. This author here, this William MacCorkle, this son of a bitch here from West Virginia, no doubt, is basically setting up a situation that says that, hey, we are the power in this hemisphere, and we will do whatever it takes to continue our power. And we cannot have powerful nations competing with us in this hemisphere. The earlier part of the paper, this is how white people tell on themselves, by the way. The earlier part of the paper tells you how important Haiti is, how important the Caribbean in general is, but Haiti, Jamaica, they mentioned the Bahamas, they mentioned Puerto Rico as insignificant, they mentioned someone else, Cuba, right? They're telling you how important this region is. And so they can't have countries to their south, like South America, or you go down to the Windward Islands and stuff like that. They cannot have superpowers or strong nations in those places. So they will do whatever it takes to make sure that there's no strong nations down there. We have a proximity problem. We're too close to their sphere of influence. But like I said to the pro-black perspective, who I can't disagree with him. He says, you build Africa now, you don't abandon these places. I agree with that. The problem I have with it is that the problem I have with that is, how are you going to go to a Haitian people right now in turmoil who says to them, we got to go build Africa first? Now, it's not, I'm not saying it's a bad idea, but what I'm saying is the people right now ain't gonna hear that. In the chat room, Joni Rosenthal says, no, I disagree. What do you disagree about? When you say, no, I disagree, you gotta follow up with what it is you're disagreeing about. Remember, guys, there's a delay from when I speak to when you hear it. So when you're typing about something I said, that could be, you know, I'm not sure how long ago, a minute or so ago, right? So as Kevin K. 42 also says that Joni Rosenthal, why do you disagree? I'll be curious to hear, why do you disagree? By the way, this is one of those rare occasions where I've gone, this is one of those rare occasions where I've gone this long, right, with a show. I try not to do these, but this paper had some length to it, and we had some good participation in the chat room, so it went longer. Joni says, no, I disagree about what's happening in Haiti is the U.S. is doing. Okay. You disagree that it's U.S. Erzulism should still be here. Do you disagree with that as well? Are they messing with my stream right now? I seem to have an error here. Can you guys hear me still? Are you guys still able to hear me? Joni says Haiti has a bunch of sellouts, but the question you have to ask yourself, Joni, is who are they selling out to? That's the important question. Who are they selling out to? As Kevin Kerr puts in the chat room, he says a lot of those sellouts are puppet plants. Who are they selling out to? I can assure you they're selling out to U.S. interests. For some reason, the image seems to be gone from my broadcast. I don't know what's going on. And we're 3 hours, just over 3 hours into this broadcast. I'm going to give you guys the time while I'm speaking right now to say whatever else you want to say. But I want to thank all you guys for joining in tonight. It was a long episode, and I gotta say, all of you stuck with me, and I appreciate that. Let me tell you, Kevin K42 says when you speak the truth, YouTube messes with you. I agree. I want to thank Kevin K42 for being here. I want to thank Joni Rosenthal. I want to thank Erzulism, NYC Beauties, I want to thank, I know I'm missing someone, Pro Black Perspective, KW Don 7, Black Excellence. I want to thank all of you guys for tuning in tonight. Make sure you guys hit the like button as well as to subscribe if any of you here happen to not be subscribed, and click the bell to be notified when I'm on again. If you like what you heard tonight and you feel other folks should hear this, especially folks who are Haitian, please share it with your community. Share it amongst your Caribbean folks, your African folks. We have to fix Haiti's problem. We got to bind together and fix the problem where it is. All right. Thank you. I see the Black Excellence says, great show as usual. NYC Beauty says, thank you. As always, a great show. And on that note, I'm going to talk to you guys again on Thursday. Johnny Rosenthal says, yes, I can be. I'm not sure what she means. But thank you guys for tuning in. Make sure to tune in on Thursday when we'll do another interesting show as well. All right? Peace to everyone. Oh, lastly, join the Discord. If you haven't joined the Discord yet, I'm going to repost the link. I know Kevin Kerr posted it. KWZ Radio's in the chat room. Yeah, thanks to them too. They posted it. Join the Discord and join the Discord. Help with this curriculum. Education is our biggest issue. Not so immediate but it's our biggest issue. Join the Discord, help with the curriculum, or if you're just a fan of the show, join the Discord and say, hey, I'm here to be a fan of the show. Until next time, guys, peace.
Thanks for listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast with your host, Koku. If you like what you just heard, we hope you pass along our web address, bittermedicineblogs.com, to your friends and colleagues, and share our show to all your social media. Be sure to check out our archive section on our website for previous podcasts. This has been a KWAZ radio production. Join us next time for another session of the Bitter Medicine Podcast. Follow us on Facebook at Bitter Medicine Show, Twitter, Bitter Meds, Tumblr, Bitter Meds, Instagram, Bitter Medicine.